For what we're going to do is start with a recap of last week. So, does anybody remember anything at all from last week? Anything whatsoever? There we go.
We learned many kinds of variables,
Yeah.
like dependent variable, independent variable, and confounding variable.
Yeah, so we had a review of all the different types of variables that we have when researching older adults. And the key ones, as you mentioned, were the independent variable, which is the thing that you change, the dependent variable, which is your outcome or the thing that you're measuring. You have confounding variables, which might impact the dependent variable, but it might not be something you've necessarily controlled. And you have the control variables, which are things that you control for or take account for as things that may impact your dependent variable. Okay? Anything else that we learned?
Last class mentioned some research standards and talk about the questionnaires and some the subjective and objective.
Yeah, so we looked at different types of data collection measures. We looked at the difference between subjective versus objective measures, but also subjective versus objective aging. So what people's chronological age was, so that is their objective age, and their subjective age being their how old they feel, okay, or how old they'd like to be. Okay, so they're feelings as opposed to things that can be measured. Anything else? It's like tumbleweed.
We talked a lot about ageism, specifically like explicit versus implicit forms of ageism and how it's a lot more prevalent than we think it is.
Exactly. So we looked at different forms of isms. So we talked about ageism, we looked at discrimination between that, and we looked at how prevalent it was in comparison to other forms of prejudice. I kind of went off on a bit of a tangent, so that is one that we are going to come back to, so we will do a lot more on ageism. But we looked to see how that was as a result of subjectivity as opposed to objectivity, i.e. what our stereotypes are around the aging principle and around older adults. And if you remember, I asked you to imagine what an older person looked like if you close your eyes, and we talked about some of those stereotypes and how we formed those. So we also looked at older workers. We looked at the benefits that could be placed from older adults remaining in the workforce. And we looked at what those benefits could be in terms of the older person, in terms of their finances, as well as their health and well-being. We looked at how an attitude is formed, what the different subsets are, i.e. the implicit and explicit, but we looked at those component parts. And if you remember what those component parts were, we had the cognitive, which is what you think, the evaluative, whether it's positive or negative, the affective, how it makes you feel, and then the conative, which is the predisposition towards action. And they are four really important concepts to grasp. We will go over them again when we're looking at attitudes, but as I mentioned, they will be on your exam. We looked at the difference between internalized versus externalized ageism, and we also then started to reflect on our own projections on aging, as well as going over the that little exercise that we did at the end, where you listened to two songs and you saw two images, and we discussed where the ageist attitudes could lie, what the consequence of those could also be. And that's really important because that is the basis for your term paper. So hopefully you'll have taken some of the information that we gave last week very specifically, because they will lead straight into your term papers. Okay? Do you have any questions about what we covered from last week? No? Okay. So this week what we're going to look at is we're going to look at some physiological changes that occur as we age. So we're going to look at the senses predominantly. So we're going to look at brain changes. We're going to look at vision. We're going to look at hearing. We're going to look at different aspects of how we interpret the world. So we're going to break them down, and we'll, across the whole of today, we're going to look at all of the different senses, but I will give you a break in the middle, don't worry. Okay? So, this is the human body. You've probably all seen one of those in your time, but what we know is as we age, the heart, these are biological facts, the heart decreases in both size and strength. It's a muscle, the same as any of your other muscles. So we know that this slows down as we age and it decreases in size. Well, what does this really mean? Well, as we age, what that means is actually our circulatory system is not quite as effective. So it might take longer to get all of your blood going around the circulatory system. It might mean that it's not as effective as in transporting oxygen or indeed glucose around the system. So as that such, you might find that as we age, we get more tired. We take longer to recover from exercise, that kind of aspect. The respiratory system takes in less oxygen. So your breathing becomes more shallow, sorry. So you're not taking in as much oxygen. Again, if you're not taking in enough oxygen, then there's a reduced amount of oxygen that's going into your bloodstream. And if that's the case, then there's reduced oxygen going to your muscles, and you have the same problem that we discussed in terms of the heart for the rest of your muscular system as well. Okay? We also know that the gastrointestinal system becomes less efficient. What we mean by this is that peristalsis slows. That is the process by which food is pushed through your digestive system. Okay? So peristalsis is where the muscles contract along the esophagus and basically squeeze your food down. What we see in terms of the gastrointestinal system, it becomes less efficient, so it slows down. So we find that might lead to issues with bowel obstructions. Also in terms of people not wanting to eat as much, and we'll come on to eating later on, and the impact that can have on ADLs, which are your activities of daily living. Also, we know the urinary tract slows. Okay? The issues that we have here is in terms of getting urinary tract infections. If we're not having as much movement through the urinary tract, well, actually then you might find that you have some kind of infections that can lead on to issues with delirium and potentially even confusion and worse later on in life. What we also know is that if people are having urinary tract issues, they tend to drink less. And if they are drinking less, they are more likely to become dehydrated. If they become dehydrated, again, that causes issues around memory. It can cause issues with balance, and it can cause other issues, again, with not having enough fluid in your system in terms of the same dehydration would cause for anybody across the life course. We know that the mitochondria become less efficient. So this is on a cellular level. So the mitochondria they're basically the powerhouses of the cell. This is where all of the respiration in the cells happen and where your energy comes from. So again, taking on the fact that you might not be eating as much, you might not be having as much oxygen as you might need, those mitochondria also lose efficiency. So essentially what we're suggesting, as you age, you might become slightly more lethargic. It might take you longer to recover from these exercises. And we also see muscle and bone elasticity drop. So in terms of your bone density, especially for women post-menopause, that can cause issues with, what's the word I'm looking for? Osteoporosis, and issues with bone density, whereby bones become much more fragile. There are ways in which we can minimize that by carrying a little bit of extra weight, be that in terms of weights or actually just carrying a little bit of extra body weight as well. In terms of your muscles, they're less elastic, which means actually it's harder for you to maintain the levels of physical activity, but also in terms of getting around and just being generally a little bit less flexible. So what we find when we've got these is they're not just physiological changes that we see, but it's the psychological implications of these. So we talked about that last week in terms of ageism. How many people in this room would consider themselves to be an older adult? Nobody. So what we find is we consider ourselves part of an in-group of youth. So we have an idea about our self-concept, yeah? So we know who we are, we know what social categories we belong to. But if we start to get tired or out of breath as we're walking up a set of stairs, or we start to see grey hairs, or we start to have issues with our urinary tract, for example, we see these as issues that are associated with age. So actually what we have to start to do is reevaluate our self-concept. So we see these physiological changes that we associate with aging. Therefore, we must ourselves be falling into that aging category. But we only see ourselves as younger. So we go through a period of what we call storm and stress, whereby you have to reevaluate your self-concept to accommodate for those physiological changes that you don't associate with your in-group, but you associate with that older adult population. Okay? So really what we're looking at today is going to be about that evaluation of self-concept. So although we're going to be looking at physiological changes, we are really going to be looking at the evaluation of self-concept in light of those physiological changes. Okay? Does that make sense? Fabulous. Excellent. So, the brain. Most of us have one, most of us use it. But what we're going to be looking at is the difference between grey and white matter. Does anybody know the difference between the two? No? Well, by the end of the lecture today, you will. So, what we see is a decline in both grey and white matter as we age. What sort of age do you think that happens? What sort of age do you think there are some physiological decline in brain size? What age do you think? Anybody want to hazard a guess? Go for it, just scream it out. 70. We think that there's a decrease in brain size from the age of 70. Anybody else want to hazard a guess? Higher, lower? 60. So we're going lower. We've got a 60 and we've got a 70. Anybody else want to give a guess? 50. Okay, we can see the direction this is going. So we've got a 70, a 60, and a 50. Anybody else? 65. Well, what we see, and I will come on to it, just bear in mind, keep those numbers in your head. So what we see is a difference between grey and white matter, and that's really important to remember. So your grey matter is basically the main structure of the brain. So this is where all of the information, the sensory information is coded, all of your memory bank, etc., is all coded, etc. And what we find is the white matter is that connective tissue, okay? So this is what carries all the neural impulses, but isn't really where most of the functioning happens. So think of it like the grey matter are the different areas of Los Angeles. So you've got your Echo Park, you've got your Silver Lake, you've got your downtown, you've got your Culver City, and the white matter are all the interstates, so the I-5, the I-10, the I-whatever, and these are all the connections between them, okay? So that's the differences. So when we're seeing differences and we're seeing the reduction in these, it depends what we're seeing the reduction in. Are we seeing the reduction in the number of houses in Silver Lake, or are we seeing a reduction in the number of lanes to the I-5? So are we seeing a reduction in the speed of a transmission between them, or are we seeing a reduction in capacity? Okay, I know it's a bit of a weird analogy, but does that make sense? Fabulous. And it is really important to understand the difference between that grey and white matter. So do you think that there are differences with age? Do you think that there's differences between them? Do you think grey matter will deteriorate first, white matter will deteriorate first?
I read in the readings that white matter stops myelinating sooner than gray matter. So white matter is like young adulthood, and then gray matter deteriorates later adulthood.
Basically, yes. So what we've got is that grey matter will widely start to deteriorate around middle age. So here what we're looking is your late 30s, 40s to early 50s. So you're seeing that's where there's quite a sizable notification of reduction in your grey matter. It tends to be towards the frontal cortex. So it's not to do with your base functioning, it's more to do with higher order functioning. So again, another simple way of remembering this is right at the front, that's your higher order functioning, all the way to the back, which is where your base functioning. So that's like your vision, that's your breathing, all of those things, okay? So it's the higher order functioning that you see a decline in. When you're looking at the white matter, what we see is actually this starts to reduce from early adulthood, okay? So again, there are certain things that we can do in terms of diet, in terms of exercise, all the usual things. They're the things that no one likes to actually do. Cut back on alcohol, make sure you increase the amount of exercise you do, eat leafy green vegetables, all those nasty things. But we know that this can actually benefit us, especially in terms of our brain in later life. So we do see reductions in both grey matter and white matter, but white matter reduces in volume earlier, okay? So, sensory decline. The reason why we're moving on to our senses is this is how we interpret the world, okay? So everything that you do is interpreted by one of your senses. So the senses of, list them for me. Vision, hearing, smell, taste, and touch, okay? Everything you do is about interpreting the world through those 5 senses. So when we're looking at physiological decline, what we're looking at is not just how these changes occur in the human body, but what the implications of these are as well. So we're going to spend quite a bit of time looking at vision, quite a bit of time looking at hearing, and then we'll touch on the others as well. So, when we're looking at vision, what we see is that about 20% of those people over the age of 75 will have some form of vision loss. And that vision loss can range anything through from mild through to severe. And what we look at is, as we age, everyone up to about, over the age of about 90, you're looking about 50% will have some substantial vision loss. So just having a quick look around the class now, what we see is most people in this classroom will have glasses, and that's as a corrective of some form of visual loss from 2020. And what we'll see is as we age, we will continue to see that deterioration. And that can be in terms of visual acuity, so the sharpness to which we see things. It can be to do with the depth in which we see things, so how far away we can see things. And also it can be to do with things like light levels. So, how many people here have ever been out at night? 1, 2 people have been out at nighttime. 3 people have been out at nighttime, 4 people have been out. Okay, of those 4 people that have been out at nighttime, have you ever seen a street lamp? Okay, so street lamps are really interesting. So what they generally do is provide a huge amount of light in a very narrow area, yeah? Okay, now all of those people who are scared to go out at night, how many of you have been out in the sunshine? Okay, no one. No one's been out in the sunshine. Okay, the reason why I'm asking you this is because there's difference between light levels. So how many times have you been outside, it's bright sunshine, then you've gone into a building and you've had to stand there and just blink your eyes a few times because it's dark inside and your eyes have got to get used to it. You're all young and your eyes can do that much quicker. And especially when we think of this at night, when we're looking at those street lights, if you're going from light to dark, to light to dark, to light to dark, because it's not a consistent light spectrum, then what we find is actually older adults will struggle with getting that differentiation between light and dark, and their eyes will take longer to adjust. And as such, they won't necessarily see as many things. And you think, well, what difference does that really make? Well, if you're driving at 30 or 40 miles an hour, or in the highway even faster, it can make the difference between life and death. So what we're saying is try to look at all of these in terms of their contextual application as well. So as I mentioned, we see a difference in luminescence, so the ability to see between light and dark and change between those situations. There are things that we can do to ameliorate this, i.e. wearing glasses with different coloured lenses. So, for example, when I go cycling, even if I cycle at night, I will wear sunglasses, but I'll wear them with a yellow lens. So actually that increases the amount of light that's getting into my eye. So actually I can go around with sunglasses on and not have any impairment, and it actually stops bugs and things going in my eye. So it's much better. And we can do that in terms of reading glasses, etc. as well. It's about ways in which we can accommodate for those changes that we've seen. Also, how many people here drive? Okay, one person, two people, three people again, same three people. So you're the three that have been out at night, so you drive at night. How many of you have ever had a car coming towards you at night? And you get that flash of light, really, especially if you go over a hill. And you get that flash of light that comes towards you. And that can often, if you think about what that's like, you'll often get like that flash bulb of light in the middle of your eye. And again, it takes you a couple of seconds to recover from that. Older adults, it can take them significantly longer to recover from that. Also, as we'll see as we go through this lecture, we'll see that there's differences in things like peripheral vision, so how much you can see around you. So again, if I came up behind you, then as soon as I come level with most of you, you'd probably see me. But what we see as we age, we see a reduction in that peripheral vision. So that can cause issues in terms of seeing who's around you, spotting danger, but also engaging with, there are lots of noises going on out there. It can change the way in which you engage with those people around you and whether or not you want to engage in more social environments. So there are ways in which, as I said, we can ameliorate this. For example, going into higher light conditions. So what we'll see now that a lot of the street lights are changing. They're changing from like halogen-style bulbs to LED bulbs because they provide a much more uniform set of light. So we can find actually lighting is becoming much, much better than ever it used to be. In terms of our hearing, we know again that there are some changes that occur as a standard part of the aging process. So what we're looking at here is about 80% of those people over the age of 85 will have some form of trouble hearing. Okay? This doesn't necessarily mean that they're all absolutely deaf, but what it does mean is there's a decrease, usually in the frequencies that we can hear. So how many people can hear that really irritating whining pitch noise now? Yeah? What we'll find is actually maybe people in their 70s wouldn't be able to hear that. So this is one of the reasons why I can't wait until I get old. We find that with hearing loss, there is a genetic component as well. So this is the same as sight loss. It might be that you'll find that everyone in your family has to have glasses, or everyone in your family has to have a hearing aid, or something along those lines. But as we age, there is still that non-genetic age component. And we'll come on to that later, and that's to do with the internal structure of the ear. When we're looking at what this does in terms of our ability to concentrate and ability to engage with the world, so when we're looking at those sensory declines and the impact that has, it might impact on our ability to detect the direction of sound. So if you hear somebody shouting, you don't know which direction they're shouting at you from. Are they shouting you from the side, from behind? Which way are they coming from? Okay? That may cause an issue in terms of sirens or warning sounds for us, especially as we age. We also might find it causes issues in terms of social situations. So again, how many people here have been in social situations where there have been more than 3 people around you? So engaging in conversation, actually listening to other people. You might have a group of 5 or 6 people, and you're having to look at who you're speaking to. But Martha over here starts talking, but if you're not looking at her, you might not know it's her that's speaking or where that noise is coming from. So we find that actually this reduction in the ability to hear impacts on your sociability, your willingness and your desire to engage in those social environments, which can have knock-on effects then for social isolation and loneliness, which we'll come on to. We'll also talk about distinguishing between background sounds and not. So again, in terms of say, a party, if you've got lots of background noise, people like clattering plates or glasses, or you've got some music on in the background and you're trying to hear people talk, you might have a bit of a struggle with it anyway. But as an older person, we find with that pitch differentiation not being the same, then actually it's harder to engage in those levels of conversation. And again, another reason why you might choose not to. What we find with people that have got hearing loss is there's often that misconception then around dementia. So you're talking to somebody and they're not responding. It isn't that they don't understand, it's the fact that they often haven't heard. So there are ways, and we're going to discuss this later on, that we can minimize that impact by how we engage with somebody in terms of maximizing our enunciation, so how well we speak, maximizing our differentiation, so how we use tonal inferences in our voice, and also something that I fail at miserably, slowing down and speaking at a very slow, methodical pace. I get very excited, especially by topics I like gerontology, and I tend to talk at about 100 miles an hour. So anyway, we have these misconceptions of dementia, and that's something that we're going to cover over the next few weeks when we're looking at actually what our misconceptions are around dementia and older adults. So the rest of them, we're going to give you this bit of an overview now. So we've talked about the 5 senses. What we find is that taste declines, and we will go over that later on this afternoon as well, but we're looking at a general decline. That can have issues for over-seasoning, issues for not wanting to eat. So how many people here like oatmeal? And how many people here would like oatmeal with nothing in it? So there's no sugar, no salt, no fruit, no jam, no chocolate, no nothing. And that was the only food you were ever allowed to eat ever again. You wouldn't like it. So what we find is actually, if people are starting to have issues with taste and everything's kind of tasting like oatmeal, then maybe you're just not eating as much because eating is no longer enjoyable. So we find there are issues in terms of socialization. So we like to all go out and eat, probably some of us a little bit too much, but we enjoy going out to eat. It's a sociable environment to do. But also it's about our nutrition, it's about our maintenance. What we find is our touch also changes, our grip strength changes. So as an example of this, how many people have been to a hospital before and stayed over in a hospital, been to visit in a hospital? Okay, so one of the most important things is hydration. So they give people, especially older people, glasses, or they give things to drink out of. What material should we make those glasses out of? Plastic? Are we talking about soft plastic, hard plastic? What kind of plastic? So we're thinking hard plastic. Anything else? What kind of materials are they made out of? Soft, like the single-use cups? Okay, so like the ones you get in a water fountain? Okay, well what we should ideally be doing is actually looking at hard plastic. And I'll tell you why. Because when we have issues around grip strength, around our ability to touch things, then what we find is that we can often cause issues with breakages. So my great aunt Annie was a prime example of this. She didn't really know her own grip strength, and she would squeeze things incredibly hard. So if you're squeezing a squidgy cup, a single-use cup, really hard, water flies everywhere. You don't know if you're going to do it or not, so you don't tend to drink as much. Similarly, if we're giving people glass and they don't grip it strong enough, they drop that. Not only is the water gone everywhere, but there's lots of broken glass. So they worry about that, so they won't necessarily drink. So what we do is the best way of doing this, of getting around it, isn't giving somebody a tippy cup with a little beaker top, because that is degrading, but it's about giving somebody a hard plastic glass, because you're not going to break the glass like you would do with a glass or even with a squidgy glass. And if you do drop it, the only thing that happens is a bit of water everywhere. Okay? So we find it's much, much easier to maintain levels of hydration, especially when people are having issues with touch and grip strength, with a harder plastic glass. Similarly, one of the other things that we have to think about when we're looking at touch is pain. And we'll discuss this in the next few weeks as well. Pain sensitivity, also how we react to pain and how we sense levels of pain and what impact that can have, especially if you're touching things that are particularly warm, particularly sharp, etc., etc. And we look at pain reporting. The other one that we look at is sense of smell, our olfactory system. Actually, this one does decline, but there's not a huge marked decrease as we age. What we find is there is a marked decrease, but that generally only happens with things like Alzheimer's disease. Okay? So yes, obviously there's going to be differences that you're going to have. So if you've got a cold, you haven't got Alzheimer's disease, you've got a cold, your sense of smell will decline there. But in terms of age-related, it's the one where we don't see any major decline. There are slight declines, but not major declines, other than in those groups where they're identified with Alzheimer's or other neurocognitive disorders. Okay. So I'm not going to labor too much on these. So the psychological implications of these sensory declines, because we've talked about them before in terms of your evaluation of self-concept, in terms of whether or not you're going to engage socially, whether or not you withdraw, whether or not you have that life satisfaction. So we talked about in terms of that oatmeal taste. It's a case of, if you're not going to enjoy these things anymore, why do we bother doing them? And often what we'll find is that actually, if you've got an older adult that's having declines in these areas, they might actually reduce their engagement with these type of areas as well. So, is everyone happy with that little bit of an overview? Because that's essentially what we're going to cover today. We're going to look at the eye in quite a lot of detail, and we're going to look at the ear in quite a lot of detail. So, what we have is normal vision changes. So as we age, this happens to everybody. We have declines in vision. The main reasons why we have declines in vision is to do with that first slide that I put up. I said, if you remember, that we see reduction in muscle strength and elasticity. Yeah? That's exactly the same for the suspensory ligaments and muscles around the eye. These allow us to change the width and the shape of our lens, which enables us to see things close up and far away. If we have a reduction in the function of these muscles, then we see a reduction in the function of the lens to change shape, and as such, our ability to see things. So when do we think sight decline happens? We're not talking about genetic ones, we're talking about general sight decline. What age do you think it happens? Give me some ages. What do you reckon? 45? Anything else? 20s? That's a very fatalistic view, but it's possible. It's possible. Anything else? What we generally see is around 35. So around about 35 is where we start to see age-related declines with our vision. Okay? So you might find that next semester I'm walking around with glasses on, but up to this point I've been relatively okay. So what we see is with age-related decline, we find that actually it's more to do with depth perception. It's more to do with the visual acuity at near and far sightedness. So that can result in people not being able to read small print. When we're looking at this in terms of the real-world applications, that can cause issues for things like instruction booklets, for reading the small print on contracts, also in terms of reading books. So some of you may actually be a little bit old school, like my good self, and you might actually enjoy holding a bound book to read. And as such, you will have the enjoyment and the engagement with that. If you're having issues with reduction in that suspensory ligament and the ability of the lens to change shape, then you may no longer be able to engage in those kind of activities. Similarly, what you'll find is you have certain levels of compensation. So you'll find that some people will be holding books at arm's length. And that's great to an extent, but your arms are only a fixed length. So as the deterioration continues, there's only so far you can hold that. Plus, unless you're a Shakespearean actor, there's very, very few social situations where you can hold a book at arm's length and not look stupid. So we have to start to look at these social accommodations as well. But it's not just about vision. Vision is linked to other things. So how many of you here have had a migraine, a real migraine, a horrible migraine? And that's linked to your vision. Often it's linked to the type of light levels that you've got as well. And we find that actually if we have visual changes, visual declines in later life, and we don't do anything about it in terms of glasses, etc., for corrective sight, then that leads to increases in things like headaches, increases in stress and tension headaches, but also in terms of eye strain as well, which causes more damage, okay? So actually, the more you strain your eyes, the more damage it can be. So of those of you who need glasses but don't want to wear them for aesthetic reasons, please wear them. You're causing yourself more damage in the long run, okay? Any questions so far? Fabulous. So what we're looking at is these changes. So as we age, these are the changes that we see as a standard form of aging. We see that the lens itself, or sorry, the cornea itself, the outside part, becomes flatter and less sensitive. So it becomes more irritable and more permeable. And by more permeable, what we mean is those little holes become slightly larger. They let more dust and things like that in. And that becomes an issue, especially in terms of the air getting in, for what we call dry eye. Okay? So older adults are more susceptible to dry eye, whereby actually their eye just dries out because it becomes more permeable and more air gets in to dry that out. What we find is that can cause issues where it changes the focal point. So when you're looking and you can see straight at something, are you viewing it, or are you seeing a hazed image, or are you seeing no image there at all? Because of the increase in permeability, what we also see is an increased risk of infections. So these can be things like conjunctivitis. It can be through infections because you get something on your fingers and your hands and you're rubbing your eyes more. But all in all, what we see is that increase in susceptibility to things like dry eye and infections. Okay? And these are standard parts of aging. So this is before we even get onto the diseases associated with the eye. When we have things like dry eye, that can cause issues with fatigue, discomfort, and decrease, as we said, to things like reading, engaging with computers, but also in terms of just keeping your eyes open. Because what we find is actually every time you close your eyes, you refresh the cornea, you refresh the contact, and you moisturize your own eyes. So if you keep them open for prolonged periods of time, actually you're drying them out. So what we find is actually older adults just don't want to engage in occupations where they have to continually do that. Okay. So what are the other changes? So we looked at the cornea. The cornea flattens. That's the important thing to remember here, and becomes more permeable. It's not just the cornea, it's the lens as well. And that links to the muscles that I talked about right at the start. The muscles lose that elasticity and can result in what we call far-sightedness. And this usually happens around middle age, towards late middle age. And essentially, it causes issues in levels of focusing. Because what happens with the lens, it loses its ability to accommodate, i.e. to change when different stimuli are there. So again, when you're looking at things that are close and far away. So it's about looking down at your screen and then looking down over at me. It's looking at the differences between those. Your eyes are able to compensate, but as we age, we lose the ability to do so. So that shape of the lens can't change as quickly because those suspensory ligaments and muscles around the eye, over here, these ones are not able to change in terms of contrast quickly enough. They're not able to react quickly enough to change that vision. Also, we're going to discuss this as we go forwards, that as we age, the lens actually changes in its color slightly. It becomes a little bit more cloudy, it becomes a bit yellowy, and as such, that can lead to issues around color blindedness. And that is generally around that blue to yellow colorblind issue. Okay? So that can mean in terms of your acuity of different blues, your acuity of different yellows, or indeed just seeing gray on those color scopes. Okay? And we'll talk about how that yellowing happens within the eye. So this gives you a little bit of a musculature of the eye to show how the lens changes shape. But when we see these muscles, they basically become slower to respond. So Think of your eyes in their 20s as, I'm trying to think of a famous sprinter that's not British, that you might know, Michael Johnson, not Jordan, he's a basketball player. So Michael Johnson, oh, that is really getting quite obtrusive, isn't it? Is it just me or is that getting worse? It is getting worse, isn't it? That's all right, because it's really starting to get to my ears now. Hopefully they'll do something about it, because that's really starting to hurt. It's really, I don't even know what it is. Is it? Oh, please turn it off. It's freezing cold in here anyway. Sorry, so Michael Johnson, going back to it, sorry, off the track. Michael Johnson, very quick response. So when he's down in the, on your marks and in the set positions, quick response muscles, yeah? What we call fast twitch muscles. As we age, that response dies down, so it's not as quick to get off those starting blocks. And your eyes are exactly the same. So your eyes that have that fast twitch response initially, so you can adjust to those far and near objects. That goes as we start to age, okay? And what we find is that we generally have two eyes, yeah? Good. That one eye, the muscles around that will change slightly differently to the one on the other side. So your left eye might be stronger than your right eye or vice versa. And that can cause issues with what we call binocular vision. So being able to see through two eyes. So again, I'm sure when you've been tired and you want to look at something, you'll squint and close one eye, yeah? I hope so, because I do that all the time. But what we find is that older adults will do that quite a lot because it's easier to see out of one eye and get the depth perception there than it is to see out of both eyes when one isn't necessarily adjusting as quickly as the other. Okay? And that's why, especially those people that have glasses, you'll find that you often have a different prescription in each eye because it's differences in terms of the musculature strength in each eye. How many people have heard of cataracts? There you go, a couple of people. Again, the same people that drive and the ones that have been out at night. Who wants to hazard a guess to what cataracts actually is? So we've all heard of cataracts, but what do we think it actually does and what it is? Go for it. Oh, you've got one already. Oh, you brought your own.
It's a loss of vision, and it's like tunnel vision. Like darkens.
Yep, slightly different to tunnel vision, and we'll come on to that one later on, that's for sure. And we see that more with what we call glaucoma or glaucoma, depending on which side of the ocean you're from. But when we're looking at cataracts, what we see is an opaque nature of the lens. So the lens itself, so that part here, becomes more cloudy. So it's not about the suspensory ligaments pulling it to make sure that you can see depth, but actually what we see is it just becomes more cloudy, and that happens to everybody as we age, okay? So this isn't something that is necessarily due to infection. There is a genetic link, and what we see is this can start as early as your mid-30s. So there is that genetic component, and early onset is much more of a risk from that. But there are things we can do. Okay, so people can, and I hate the idea of it myself because I really hate the idea of anything going anywhere near my eye, but you can replace the lens. You have to be conscious at that point as well. You can't be under general anesthetic. But it's about basically, there is something you can do. So it isn't reversible in terms of the actual condition, but we can now get to the stage where we can replace the actual lens. Again, most older adults, most adults, will live long enough to have some form of cataracts happen. So it isn't something that is due to an infection, but it is a standard part of the aging process. But it happens to different varying degrees. And it starts off, so how many people here love a good old Instagram filter? Yeah, so it might turn a little hazy. You might have the old Hollywood vibe to it, so it kind of makes things a little bit like you're looking out over a steamy window. That's kind of what cataract starts with. It starts with that kind of Instagram haze to make everything seem really pretty. And then it goes all the way through to you can't actually see anything. Okay? So that's generally what starts happening. It starts with what they call it in the literature, milking of the lens. So it becomes a milky color. So generally speaking, most of the population is around about well, I say most, a large proportion of the population has 20/40 vision. So 20/20 is perfect vision. So here what we've got is about 3.5 million Americans today have got 20/40 vision. This is corrected by glasses. Okay? So this enables you to basically have vision that goes back up to normal, or back up to around about 20/20 vision when you've got that level of correction. And this is something that is increasing exponentially, not because of the number of people being born, not because our eyesight's getting worse, but because we're living longer. So by 2050, they're expecting it to be up to about 7 million people living in the US with corrected vision. So that's not a huge issue. What we find is those people who are more susceptible to having poorer eyesight are non-Hispanic whites, African Americans, and what we find is Hispanics are getting large proportions, but that's based on diabetes, something that we'll come back to later, and that's mainly a lifestyle factor. Then we have 2200 corrected vision, which is otherwise known as legally blind. Exactly. At the moment, we're looking at about 1 million Americans, look to double by about 2050. Again, the predominant reason for this is because people are living longer. So it's not because our eyesight is becoming worse or anything else. It's just because the number of people are increasing. Again, we're looking at non-Hispanic whites being the largest population, with African Americans basically following up quite quickly because of glaucoma. Okay? So different racial ethnic groups are susceptible to different diseases as we age, more so than others. Again, this shows more of a genetic link, a genetic predisposition, but not something that is cause and effect. Okay, so it's not necessarily guaranteed. So how do we correct these errors? So what we see is, this is how we see. Are we all happy with how we see? So basically, light comes into the eye, gets refracted, gets turned upside down through your retina here, and is basically projected onto the back of your eye upside down. And your brain then processes this and flips everything up, because otherwise you'd think you're walking on the ceiling the whole time. Okay? What happens in terms of this? We can change the issues that we have in terms of cataracts, in terms of lens issues with glasses. We can change them with surgery, so it might be laser eye surgery. We could do it in terms of replacing the lens as well. But what we also find, as we age, those people that have got short-sightedness when they're growing up, they can actually stop needing glasses. So for example, my sister was a perfect example of this. She used to have short-sightedness, and she used to have glasses for this. As she's got older, she's had issues with long-sightedness. Actually, her eyes have corrected themselves as she has aged, because as you age, you have more issues with long-sightedness, and essentially her eyes have just balanced out. But what we find, as we said, in terms of prescription strength, your eyes are not the same. You can have you could have long-sightedness in one eye, short-sightedness in another eye. You can have variations of combinations of each of these. Or you could be like my mother, I love her to bits, but she's got varifocals because she's got many, many issues with her eyes. So she's got really, really strong ones at the bottom, all the way up to quite light at the top, and they're different for each eye as well, which is great when it comes to buying glasses because they're usually several $100s each. Okay, so what we're going to do is we're going to go through a few of these visual changes that happen, and we're going to go through a few of these visual conditions, and we're going to look at things like tunnel vision, just to show you in real world what this actually means and what this actually looks like. So one on the left, we're going to use this image again and again and again, but as you can see, the one on the right is what happens when cataracts are basically developing. Okay, so this isn't obviously all the way to the end stage, but this is quite severe cataracts. What we see is it causes that cloudy or blurred vision that we talked about, so the milking of the lens. It can cause issues with things like headlights, so you get that glare. So imagine if you're driving again, and you're driving in the rain, and you get water on your windshield, and you get somebody with headlights straight towards you, it just spreads out everywhere, doesn't it? You can't really see very well. And that's the same sort of thing that you find in terms of that halo of light that can occur around a light fitting or around another source of light if you have cataracts. Because your brain tries to interpret those images that you see, if, for example, you've got one eye that's better than the other, then actually it might interpret that as two separate signals. So you've got something cloudy in one eye, something less cloudy in the other, and you might actually result in having double vision because your brain is trying to interpret the data it is collecting, the way it's interpreting the world. And we find that actually you could end up having two different sources of information being processed. So the lens in and of itself is made up of like aqueous humours, so water by and large, and bits of protein and stuff. What we find is that as we age, these proteins tend to clump together, and that's what causes that cloudiness. Because the proteins tend to clump together, the lens becomes slightly drier because everything is slightly more permeable, and it causes issues with brightness, colour perception, as you can see from that image on the top right. There are certain things that we can do to reduce our likelihood of getting severe cataracts as we age. So make sure you stay hydrated. If you're out in the sunshine, make sure you wear sunglasses. Try to minimize alcohol use and don't smoke, because all of these are risk factors for developing more severe cataracts as we age. So I know this is all jolly, jolly, joy, joy, but we're also going to move on so we can see glaucoma. So this is what we might imagine as tunnel vision. This is where the outside of the focus becomes much, much darker. We lose that visual acuity, or we actually end up losing that sight altogether. Again, this is not end-stage glaucoma. End-stage glaucoma is where the whole of the vision is black. So essentially, what happens is you don't tend to have symptoms in the early stages of glaucoma. What you tend to do is when you go to have your eye tests, they only see the glaucoma when they're dilating the pupil. So when they, squirt the air in there or squirt the dye in there, that's when they'll start to see the early stages of glaucoma. If they don't treat it, the first thing to go is your peripheral vision, and if that gets worse and worse and worse, that will lead to blindness. Essentially what happens within glaucoma, it's a disease within the optic nerve. So if you remember the vision of the eye, that stem that comes out of the back of it, the optic nerve, is basically a disease that occurs that causes damage in that particular area and causes issues with the blood vessels behind the eye. And something else we'll be looking at that in terms of that will be in terms of wet macular degeneration later on. So the risk factors, ethnicity. So genetics are a big risk factor. So being African American is a big risk factor. Also being over the age of 60 is a big risk factor. One of the other things that you can do to minimize your risk is please do not develop diabetes. Diabetes is a risk factor for most vision issues. Okay? So one of the most cited complications for diabetes is actually blindness. Okay? So that is what happens with glaucoma. Glaucoma isn't the only one. This is wet macular or macular degeneration. This takes two forms. So you have age-related macular degeneration, which is a degeneration of, surprise, surprise, the macula. And there are two forms. You have dry macular degeneration and wet macular degeneration. Dry macular degeneration, as it sounds, is dry. The macula essentially starts to thin, starts to dry out, and is less receptive, and you start to have issues with vision, with seeing focus, and also then in terms of especially the center part of your eye. So it's the opposite to glaucoma in that sense. So when you're looking at how the eye actually works, you focus your image through the fovea and on the optic nerve, and that's where the damage occurs in the macula. Okay? And that's why you have that issue around the center of the vision. Wet macular degeneration is again to do with the macula, but what we see is blood vessels rupturing in the macula, causing blood to basically permeate through that membrane, and that's why it's wet macular degeneration. You can have just dry macular degeneration, but if you have wet macular degeneration, it always starts with having dry macular degeneration first, okay? So you can have dry on its own, but wet always follows dry. So again, in the early stages, similar to glaucoma, you have no real symptoms. It's only something you can really see if you go to have your eyes tested. So it is something you should do relatively frequently because it can be early onset. So it's often a genetic link, but it is something that we can see earlier and earlier. So again, you're looking from your mid-30s to 40s onwards. So it is something we should recommend in terms of getting your vision tested. One of the ways we can prevent this is making sure that we have a wide variety of healthy diets. So you've got your vitamins, you've got your minerals, you've got your leafy greens, all of those kinds of things. Wet macular degeneration is the leading cause of vision for those people over the age of 50. And there's not a huge amount that we can do about it, to be honest with you. Again, we can reduce our risk by making sure that we exercise to make sure that the blood flow is healthy to the eyes. We can stop smoking, stop drinking, eat free, leafy vegetables, etc., etc., etc. It is a slow and progressive disease that will eventually lead to blindness. This is not something that happens to every older adult before you all start to get panicky. At no means are we saying this happens to everybody, but there are certain risk factors that can lead this to develop more severely and earlier as well. Any questions so far? I know we're going through this at quite a pace, but I want to try and get quite a lot of information for you so you understand the readings that we're going through. So we have diabetes. Diabetes is quite a risk factor, or quite a risk factor for vision impaired, and also age is a risk factor for developing diabetes. Especially for what we call diabetic retinopathy. So this is where the blood vessels change around the eye. So you can see this is your normal eye, and then with diabetic retinopathy, we see hemorrhages in those blood vessels all over the eye, and that causes issues with sight loss. Okay? And similarly to wet macular degeneration, it can cause irreversible damage to the eye, which ends up resulting in blindness. But if you have diabetes, you're also more likely to develop more severe versions of glaucoma and of cataracts. So here the main thing is make sure we're trying to reduce our chances of diabetes. Obviously, not all diabetes are lifestyle, so you can have genetic factors, so type 1 diabetes. The longer you have diabetes, the more likely you are to develop these, and the more likely you are to develop complications around these. But less so if you can control your cholesterol and your blood pressure. So again, one of the ways in which we can do this is by maintaining activity levels as we age. Because one of the things that we see as we age compared to younger people is the issues around orientation. So this is looking at direction. Here you can see it very much in terms of the way light is used, but the direction in which light is used. So if you're looking at the one on the left, you're looking at the images on the left, you can see the direction in which the light's going, can't you? So you can see whether it's left to right, whether you can see it's diagonal left to right, up or down, etc. But what about the one on the right-hand side? Can we see that as much? So here what we're looking at is the clarity of image. So if you remember when we looked at that in terms of cataracts, cataracts can cause an issue in terms of high noise volume for being able to identify directionality in vision, okay? But it's not just things like cataracts, it's general aging as well. So what we find is older adults have more difficulty in identifying orientation anyway. So even on the one on the left, older adults might struggle more with identifying that because of the general changes that we see in the eye structure and function as we age. And in terms of the high noise, try again. There we go. What we see is both young and old people have issues with high noise situations. So this one is more of a natural state for an older person, but even if we put it into an artificial testing environment, both younger and older people will have issues in that high noise environment. What we see in terms of age-related differences is that it's generally to do with things like the levels of light that are available. Because again, if you remember when we looked at the first initial stages of eye changes, it was to do with the level of the light getting into the eye as well. So be able to focus, be able to get that visual acuity up, we need to maintain the levels of light functioning. And there are going to be some differences that occur because of age and also because of other environmental factors as well. So we talked about field of view. So it's not just the quality of the view, but actually the level in which we can see. So what we generally see is as we start off our aging process, even to middle age, we have a field of view. We've got our eyes on the front of our heads. We're not like chameleons. We've got eyes on the front of our heads, so we can generally see up until around there. It's about 180 degrees. So we can see everything in front of us and to the sides, even if it's just vaguely blurry on our sides. But as we age, we see a reduction from about 180 to 120 degrees in our vision, which might not seem a lot, but it's quite difficult when you can't see people coming up behind you, or you're walking down the street and somebody taps you on the shoulder, or somebody approaches you from the side and you just don't see them. So we can find in terms of our activities of daily living, it's really important to put this in terms of contexts. So we need to be able to see what happens in terms of our field of vision by looking at the impact that changes of these perceptions can have. So it's not just the visual field that we have an issue with, but also in terms of the motion detection. So what we find is as we age, we might not necessarily be able to detect the speed at which something is moving. So that might cause us issues, as we'll discuss next week, in terms of our driving. So it might cause us issues in our ability to understand how quickly a car is coming towards us, but also how quickly ourselves are traveling. It might also be issues in terms of being able to see moving objects. So if an object is moving too quickly and your eye cannot focus on that, you may actually not even see that object. So it's really important to understand here that it's not just these basic perceptions of color, of depth, etc., but actually we're looking at functional decline of how we perceive the eye. So we talked right at the start in terms of the senses being how we perceive the whole of the world. Vision is one of those most important ones. Similarly then when we're looking at the type of, so the last slide, we looked at was visual noise. If there's higher levels of visual noise, then actually we find that all of these are exacerbated. So if there's higher levels of distractor, then actually the ability to identify in terms of acuity, but also in terms of motion and speed, etc., these all decline if there is more noise for your brain to process. So what are these other perceptual differences? So it's not just perceptions in terms of speed, but also we've got to have a look at things like the adaptation for light and dark. So what we find, and we will discuss more next week, is that older adults have issues in the dark. So that can be in terms of seeing between light and dark. So we discussed the issues of road lights, street lighting, but also generally just being out in the dark anyway. So when we're discussing driving next week, we'll discuss this in terms of whether older adults actually self-monitor. So actually they realize that they're unable to see these differentials in terms of low light or dark conditions. So actually they self-regulate and self-monitor so they no longer drive at night. Because it also relieves that sensitivity in glare. So we talked about that flash bulb. So when a car is coming over the brow of a hill and flashes you in the eyes, actually that lasts much, much longer, that glare, that flash bulb, than it does for a younger person. And again, these are due to the changes in the physical shape of the eye, but also in terms of those links. So again, when we're looking at those connections, you've got to remember where the eye is. Whereabouts is the eye? in your head, and it's connected directly to the brain. And what happens else as we age? Reductions in the white matter. So the connections, so the speed in which these connections are actually transmitted. So that's why we're seeing some of these changes. It's all linked together, okay? So when we're looking at brain changes and we're looking at visual changes, they do not happen in isolation. Also in terms of the contrast sensitivity. So this is about the starting of cataracts, so the changes in blue-yellow blindness. Also in terms of object identification. So you remember back to that first image when we had the cataracts, if you've got a really blurry image, are you going to be able to identify what that image is necessarily? Older people tend to use what we call, it's a different form of processing, which we'll talk about later, top-down versus bottom-up processing based on context as opposed to actually seeing something. We're relying on the context we're in to actually apply previous knowledge rather than actually processing the stimuli which we're encountering. And going back to that slowing. So because of the changes in the white matter, because of the changes in the eye, we see a processing speed decline of up to about 50% as we age. Okay? And also then in terms of what we can see in terms of color and lightness, they also change in terms of our visual thresholds. Okay? Any questions on this so far? Okay? Please ask. If you've got a question, then I'm sure somebody else has got the same question. I know I'm going 100 miles an hour, but there is a lot of material that I want us to cover. But that also means if there are any questions, please speak up. Okay? Again, the reason why I say please speak up is because this will be on your exam, so it's really important that you understand this. Okay, so we talked briefly about object identification. Well, this can be as a result of changes in the ability of the lens to change shape, but also in terms of the development of cataracts. Older adults, generally, this is without things like glaucoma or advanced cataracts, generally require greater stimulus exposure to be able to identify an object. So think of this in terms of flashing an object up in front of somebody or showing somebody it for a few milliseconds. It takes an older person longer to process what that image is. So again, you might think, well, this is a lab-based experiment. What impact does that have? But what I want you to think about and what will form the basis of the discussion this week is going to be the real-world implications of changes in that greater stimulus exposure requirement. So what happens if you require greater exposure to be able to identify an object? What happens if you require greater levels of light to be able to identify what an object is? What happens if you require larger exposure to these stimuli, for example, directions on a road sign as you're driving past, warning signs as you're going past something? What happens if something just flashes up in front of you? Are you going to be able to identify what that is and what your course of action should be? And similarly, when we're looking at driving, and we're looking at driving next week, we'll also look at the physical implications in terms of, well, actually, it might take you longer to process what that object is, but is it also going to take you longer to react to that? So we'll be looking at reaction times as well. So all of these weeks are interlinked, I promise you. So what can we do for vision loss? What can we potentially do? I promise you, if you engage with this slide, I'll give you a break.
When we think about people aging in their homes, we want to keep them in their homes, so we want to modify homes so that they have proper lighting, and that also falls under like sundowning, when older people at a certain time of day, they start to confuse daytime with nighttime, with vision loss and sometimes dementia. We need to have like systems in place where we do close the curtains, because it is trying to get them to know that it's evening time, but also having proper lighting in the home around like when they're trying to get ready for bed and stuff like that.
Okay, so especially in terms of the last point, when you're saying about being able to give orientation between day and night, that's generally more to do with disease states, so to do with Alzheimer's, to do with dementias, etc., rather than general aging. But yes, the levels of light are really important. It's about maximizing those levels of light. So think of this in terms of socialization. If you have issues going out at night, how many people here have walked around the streets of Los Angeles at any point? What is the state of the sidewalks? Are they really nice? Are they pristine? Or have they got lots of potholes and different issues? It's the latter. There's lots of holes, there's lots of uneven surfaces, and there's lots of these ruddy bird and lime scooters littering all over the place as well. So what we've got are slips, trips, and falls hazards. If you're going out at night, or if you're supposed to be going and see your friends and it's past sunset, and you know that your vision isn't quite as good as it should be, are you likely to be going out? No. So what we see, especially when we have shorter days, we have greater levels of social isolation for older adults and loneliness because they're not engaging socially, they're not going out as much, because there is that fear of falling over. There's that fear of not being able to see what's around the next corner because the levels of light aren't sufficient. So when we're looking at this in terms of the built environment, what we should be doing is actually creating environments that enable older adults to navigate spaces where they can actually engage at different times of the day and night. So getting rid of these lights that create huge amounts of luminosity in a small area, these street lights, and actually creating the ones that have a larger spread to generally illuminate a larger area over less energy requirements as well by using LEDs. So yes, in a short, lighting is good. Anything else that we can do? I'll give you a clue. Some of you are currently sporting different models on your face. Glasses, yeah. We've got visual changes through glasses. We can give people glasses to wear. But we can also give people glasses that change in terms of their color. So again, another example of this, with my mother, she's got her varifocals, but they're also heavily, heavily, heavily tinted. So as soon as any light comes and shines on them, they change, they're just totally black. Because actually protecting your eyes from the sun is just as important if you're having some form of decline as it is when you're younger as well. Obviously having different types of glasses, increasing those levels of light, and also the levels of magnification. So we talked about older adults have issues with small print. Why not make things large print? That's why one of my friends who is almost totally blind loves his Apple products, loves his iPhone, because you can change it so it's the print on anything is so big you can zoom into basically anything and everything. And it was really great for different readers. But these are the different accommodations that we can make for low-level vision issues, okay? Right. I want you to engage with me now. I want you to tell me what were the key things that we've done in terms of vision. Anything? We've learned anything in the last hour and 15 minutes with regards to vision? Go for it.
We learned the different ways we can protect our vision as we age, whether it's with sunglasses and sufficient lighting in our homes and like using our blinds correctly and the lighting of our like everyday phones and stuff.
Yeah, exactly. So what we're looking at here is one of the most important things as we start to age is to make sure we have sufficient light. Make sure we're looking after our eyes as we go through our life course. We know that there are some genetic components, but there are lifestyle factors that can influence what level of eyesight loss we experience as we age. So we know that there's going to be some loss, as we know there's going to be sensory loss across the board, but it's the level to which that occurs. Yeah? Anything else anyone wants to go over? Any questions that you've got about vision? Okay, I'm expecting 100% when we're doing all of the anatomy of the eye and what parts are linked to what. We're not going to do the anatomy of the eye, don't worry. But we will be looking at the key functionality. Okay, it is 20 past now. I'll give you a break until 1/2 past, and then we're going to come back and we are going to discuss the vision. Sorry, we're going to discuss hearing. I would suggest, if you want to, if you're yawning already, get a little bit of fresh air, get some coffee behind you, because it's quite complex when we're looking at the constructs within the ear. Okay? I will catch you on the other side. So you have 10 minutes. Okay, ladies and gentlemen, we're back in the room. We are now going to hit the ground running, and we're not going to hit it running, we're going to hit it running at a sprint-style pace. So we've done vision. That means that we are now on to hearing. Okay, so this is your ear. So who knows how we hear? Who wants to talk me through the hearing process? Anybody? Is anybody hearing me now? Ha ha ha. Go for it.
You hear a sound and it is localized with your pinna, and then it goes through the ear canal, and then your malleus, incus, and stapes it like hits all of those, and it vibrates in the
Yeah. So basically, that's your conductive pathway of hearing. So essentially, what happens is noise or sound waves will come in, and they're concentrated through the pinna, and it goes through, and it causes oscillations or movement in your ossicles, in your anvil, hammer, and stirrup, the three smallest bones in your body. Okay, you'll remember those three, I'm sure. And essentially, what happens is they vibrate, and it passes on a neural signal. Okay, so it causes the fluid in the cochlea to move, and that is what causes the neural transmitters, the neural signals, to go off into your brain so you can actually hear. So your brain can then transmit what that sound is. Okay? So that is the basic premise, and that's what happens when everything works well. So hearing, as we discussed earlier on, is one of the things that can impact or can be impacted most on older adults. So you're looking at about 33% of those people up to the age of 70, 75 have hearing loss. But we're looking around about 80% of those people over the age of 90 will have some form of substantial hearing loss. So we're looking at quite a large proportion, okay? We're looking at a large proportion. That doesn't mean to say that they're all deaf, but as we said before, it's looking at some form of impairment. It can occur in one ear, it can occur in both ears, but generally speaking, it happens, we see some deterioration if we're going to see some deterioration in both ears, but it's often worse in one over the other, okay? So, we're not just looking at hearing as one aspect. There are certain aspects. So if you remember when we were looking at standardized hearing loss, the first thing I mentioned to you was frequency, okay? So that is the pitch. And this really horrible whining noise that we've got from, not me, but from the air conditioning, that is to do with frequency and pitch, okay? So we can all hear it because it's young people and dogs that can hear that. But if we were older, we'd be fine. We wouldn't be irritated by that noise. And then you've got the amplitude, or the hertz. This is how loud something is. So the problem that you've got in this lecture is you've got me speaking very loudly and the whining, whinging noise of the air conditioning. So basically your senses are being assaulted. But those are the two things that we've got to really look at, is the amplitude and the frequency, okay? So we're going to see many, many diagrams, different diagrams of the ear, because I want to talk you through different aspects based on both the function of sound, the process of hearing, and the structure of the ear. So I talked to you before about the noise, the conductive sound coming in, and that basically moving the liquid within the cochlea. So the cochlea is fluid filled, okay? So this is where you've got liquid in there, but inside the cochlea, you've also got lots of little hairs, okay? So dependent on how the fluid moves over those hairs, depends on the strength of the neural signal and also the type of the neural signal. So what we've got is, where is it, the oval window, or the round window here. So what we've got is the oval window here, which is the entrance to the cochlea. And essentially what we've got is how different sounds are transmitted in. So the basal membrane, so this is what we said here, inside the cochlea, is all lined with hairs. So it's all about those hairs. And we're going to discuss what happens when you either get infection or you get damage from lots of loud noise. Because it is these hairs which cause us to hear. They also, as we're going to go on to later on when we're looking at the vestibular system, will also cause us to be able to balance. So another issue that older people will have with their ears is the fact that they might have issues with the hairs on the cochlea, which can cause issues for balance. So your vestibular system acts almost like a gyroscope. Okay? So these are the issues. So just as with vision, it's not just about, vision isn't just about seeing, it's about how we interpret the world. Hearing is also about how we interpret the world, but it's also about things like balance, okay? So it's not just one system that is impacted. So don't worry about all of this to a great extent. Just make sure that you identify the main areas of the ear. So what we're looking at is these functions here. So we're looking at understanding the pinna, we're looking where the cochlea is, and we're looking at the vestibules, which we'll come on to later on as well. So you don't need to worry about labeling a diagram of the ear the same as you don't with the eye, but you need to know what these main functions are. So when we're looking at hearing loss that occurs across the life course, there are different things that can be drivers for this. Obviously, there could be things like viruses. It could be an illness that occurs at some point throughout the life course. But it could also be through things like traumatic brain injury. So some of you might have heard of Professor Iremir, Andre Iremir. His lab looks at traumatic brain injury. And actually what we find is that older adults are more at risk than any other age group of traumatic brain injury. And that doesn't necessarily mean that people are going around falling over all the time, but it could be that they're in an accident. It could be due to incident of just banging their head against something along the side, or an issue that happens during sleep, as well as obviously car accidents, etc., etc. But older people are more at risk, and that can also cause issues with both vision and hearing. We also have to look at things like medicine's toxicity and interaction effects. So these can impact on the hairs inside the cochlea. So this can cause the either responsiveness of them or indeed cause them to stop working. So we find that medications toxicity can cause issues for hearing, much more so than it does so with vision. Things like heart attack, stroke, diabetes, cancer, all impact on the hearing system as well. And we're going to talk about that as we go forwards. But what we see is a standard decrease in the levels of frequency that we can hear. And I've got a lovely little moving graph that you can see very shortly on that. In fact, you can see it now. So this is what we call prebiscusis, which is age-related hearing loss. Ooh, fancy chart that moves. I have good animations, just saying. So what we have is standard prebiscusis, and then we have early onset prebiscusis or accelerated prebiscusis. What we're seeing here is the change in the expected hearing. So where we can or where we can't hear to in terms of decibels, so in terms of the noise that we have to be able to hear, and also then in terms of the hertz. So there were the two things, if you remember, the frequency and the amplitude. Frequency across the top and amplitude across the side. Okay? So here what we see is that hearing loss, similarly to vision loss and similarly to white matter loss, in the brain, can occur from like the mid-30s, but becomes significantly worse from the 50s to 60s, etc. So that's where we start to see more of that differentiation. Again, I'm going to do this. I said I apologize, but I have an aside every now and again. It was one of the things that happened in the UK. They understood the differences in pitch and frequencies. So what they used to do, they did this for a short period of time until the European court said they couldn't do it because actually it was discrimination and tantamount to torture, was they used to play very high frequency sounds like this in areas where youths would gather and cause problems, because older people and people in their 30s, 40s, 50s wouldn't hear the high pitched, and it was really, really high frequency. But younger people and dogs really suffered with it, and it can cause actually permanent hearing damage. So they had to stop doing that. But it was one way in which this knowledge base can actually cause real world applications. Because it was something that would never affect people as they started to age past their mid-30s. So hearing loss with men tends to occur faster than with women, and there are many reasons for that. You might say that it's due to environmental damages, but this is generally because men, when we're looking at the wider sphere, men are in positions where they encounter more noise. So generally, if you're looking at construction workers tend to be men. More manual laborers tend to be men. Not saying that women can't do this, but the vast majority of workers in these fields are men. And when we're looking at larger numbers, then this is when we start to see that loss due to environmental damage. But also, we're looking at environmental damage. So for example, if you do 508 at some point next semester or thereafter, you'll find that we look at things like environmental damage caused by noise and noise pollution. So how many people live in Los Angeles? Quite a few are you, I hope. So what you'll find is that the noise in something like a big city like this can cause massive damage to your hearing, because when we're looking at the safe levels, I've got a chart for you later on, but the safe levels of noise, you're going to be really, really surprised, because what can happen is it causes loss of function within the ear, and is often irreversible. Okay? So once this damage has occurred, if the cells die, the hair cells die, then essentially they're just flopping backwards and forwards and not producing any signals. Okay? And that is not reversible. So what about hearing loss across the US? Because that's what you're interested in. Let's see what's age-related and what's not age-related. So what we find is that things like noise-related are not age-related. So how many people here go to concerts, music concerts of popular music artists? Well, what you'll find is actually prolonged exposure to those loud noises is actually very damaging to your ears. So I've been to 2 concerts this week, and probably not great for my ears, but they're not rock concerts, don't worry, both have been classical. But even so, you're looking at the level of noise. And that's essentially all, whatever it is, whether it's a truck going past your ear or whether it's somebody singing an aria, it's still noise. Okay? And that's one of the other issues that you find, especially if you're walking around downtown Los Angeles, because they've got very tall buildings. And if you're ever walking around and there's a siren going past, which is basically every 30 seconds, that noise is incredibly loud. And that in and of itself can cause hearing damage. When we're looking at age-related loss, this can be due to high blood pressure. It can be due to cardiovascular issues such as stroke or heart conditions. It can be down to bacterial infections, as well as things that we've discussed before, like medicines toxicity, tumors, traumatic brain injury and head injuries, that kind of thing. Because when we're looking at how this affects people across the US, what we can see is it affects different ages in different ways. So about 1 in 3 people over the age of 60 have hearing loss. 1 in 5 teenagers now has some form of hearing loss. So 20% of teenagers have some form of hearing loss. So how many people have insertive headphones? So like earpods, what pods? AirPods? Something pods with an I in there somewhere. How many people also clean their ears with Q-tips? These are all bad things to do. I can say this because I clean my ears with Q-tips and I have pod phone things as well. But they are bad for you, okay? They will actually lead to you being completely deaf in about 3 years. No. They will cause issues in later life. What we find generationally, we've got about 1 in 6 baby boomers, so those people in their 50s to 60s, have hearing loss. At the moment, in terms of Gen Xers, we've got about 1 in 14. So we see cumulative effect across the life course. As we age as a cohort, and as we expose ourselves to different things, we're going to see cumulative damage. Again, when we're looking at concerts, we're now much more aware of concert noise. And we'll find that most concerts, other than if you go to an AC/DC concert, trust me on this one, they're regulated in terms of the volume. So do not sit next to one of the cannons in an AC/DC concert because it hurts for days afterwards. Again, take my word for this. You can ask a quick question, you can ask a long question, whatever you would like.
So this means a non-age related versus age related. This means that maybe our group in this classroom, we're non-age related and we're at risk of just long-lasting noises as concerts and maybe in the car really loud. But when we get older, we have to pay attention to the bottom ones. Is that how we should interpret this?
What we're saying is that there are non-age related and age. So even if you never go to a concert, you never have sirens, you never have anything, you also got to be aware of the other aspects like diabetes, high blood pressure, because they're age related.
As we get older,
you're going to have those on top of the stuff that you've got from having your iPod, earpod, phone things in your ear. Go for it. Ask a question.
I don't know if I'm missing something or if it could be both, but head injuries, we're not expected to have those in old age, right?
If you remember what I said was older adults are the most susceptible group. They're most likely to have a head injury of any other age group. And partly that's down to falls. Yeah. Where am I? I'm going to get back on track, I keep looking at that clock. They put that up this semester. They hadn't had it before, and it really off-puts me. So this is the table of what we should be doing, what we should be hearing, what we should be listening to. So obviously this is a quiet conversation. You're not worried about listening to me too much, but actually you'll find that the decibels in this room will probably go between 60 to 80 decibels, depending on how loud I'm squawking at any one point. A general classroom, if you're a teacher in a classroom, what do you think about the average decibels is that you'll get on an everyday basis when you've got a room full of kids and they're all talking and whatever children do? What do you think? 70? So any differences on 70? An average classroom can get up to about 120 decibels, which is the same as like a rock band or thunder in terms of constant noise. I don't know, I don't eat with students. Sorry. Yeah, the food courts, etc., they can be very loud because you've not got just people talking, but you've also got clattering of different things, you've got smashing of ovens. The other thing you've got is lots of like beeping noises. So when little alarms are going off when they've got to wash things or when they should take things out of the oven, and they're at a higher frequency and also can cause more issues as well. So we've got the types of noise that we're all being susceptible to. We've got these, and these are all lovely, and we're talking about that in terms of thunder, in terms of concerts, in terms of all the classroom settings, all these other things, lovely. But when does damage occur? What sort of volume do you think damage can occur from? Anyone has a guess? Scream and shout it out. Oh.
Is this on?
Yes, John.
Do you mean like cumulatively or just from one incident of noise?
So what is the red flag? So above which noise would you say, or volume would you say, actually you start to have some cumulative damage? Because if you're talking like, so for example, in a quiet office at 40 decibels, you're unlikely to have cumulative damage of that noise.
Say 80.
I'd say you've been stealing looks at my slides. Because basically anything over about 80 decibels, a sustained exposure is where we start to see damage related to the levels of noise. So if you're in traffic, for example, that can often be more. If you're looking at roadworks, especially if you're one of the people that's doing the roadworks, that can be sustained damage. And you'll notice that when you've got the fire trucks and things going past, they've all got big earphones on. That's not because they're listening to the newest Amy Winehouse song, she's dead, Lady Gaga song or anything like that. It's because they're trying to cancel out some of the noise. So I only said Amy Winehouse because she was on the radio earlier on. Anyway, I'll try to skip over that one. What we should say is that we should avoid anything over 130. So we can listen to thunder, but we shouldn't go to we shouldn't go to a loud rock concert, because these can often be much, much more. And similarly, what you'll find is that those of you, I'm sure I can see amongst you, there are a few headbangers. You like to go to these concerts in your mosh pits, stand right by the speakers and bang your head up and down. That is not doing you any favors. The best thing you can do is go to a silent disco and have the earphones on the outside of your head, not on the inside, and see what damage you can result from that way. So, something I want to do, see if we can do this a little bit. We've got a little bit of time, Promise it won't take too long. Let's see if this works. Dun, dun, dun. Okay, let's see. We'll see how this works.
Hi, Hadley. How's it going?
Good, Grandpa.
What'd you do in school today?
That's not normal.
Well, one main thing was that media got canceled, so our class got to either write or draw something.
And what did you write or draw?
Well, I wrote something, and I call it the random fact of the day. Would you like to hear it?
I'd love to.
Is we can listen
Random
to
fact
a
of the
normal
day.
speech sound, and you
Did
can
you know
see
that if you dug a hole from one side of the earth to the other and you
can see
jumped
all
through
of the
it,
letters and all of the
you
words here.
would go to the other side
If you've got
immediately. It
mild
would only
hearing
take you
loss,
12 minutes. The cool thing is that when you jump in
you
the
can
hole,
start to see
you
that there are
can't get
some
out of it because
sounds
the
that are
gravity
missing.
would pull you
Like the
back. This process would
TH
repeat until you
sounds.
die.
They tend to be the
Oh,
ones that
that's
tend to
terrible.
fall
Well,
off first.
there's a
The
reason
soft
later on in the
sounds.
story
And we can
why you
start to hear
shouldn't
some
dig a
muffling.
hole.
You got more?
Mm-hmm.
All right.
We'll wait till they start their conversation again.
Hi, Hadley. How's it going?
Good, Grandpa.
What'd you do in school today?
Well,
This can be
one main thing
moderate.
that
This is
media got
moderate
canceled, so our
hearing
class
loss. And you can
got to
start to see
either
again
write
what
or
we're
draw
missing is
something.
the other
Yeah,
soft
what
sounds,
did you write
not
or
just the
draw?
THs,
Well, I
but the
wrote something
CHs,
and
the
I call it the random
s
fact
sorts
of
of
the day.
sounds.
Would you
The
like to
soft
hear
kind of
it?
I'd
rolling
love to.
sounds that you get in your mouth.
Random fact of the day. Did you know that if you
Ex-
dug a hole
exactly
from
that-
one side of the earth to the
But
other
that's
and you
partly
jumped
the point.
through it, you would go to the other side immediately. It would only take you 12
And
minutes.
then the
cool
severe,
thing
what we
that
see is we actually
everything
drop out
that
even
you
more
can't
of the
get out
words.
of it because
So
it's
here we're
really
missing out a
important.
lot of the
Process
vowel
is
sounds.
until you
Even
die.
if they're not full vowel sounds,
Oh.
they're the consonants that you pull together to make those vowel sounds as well. So actually it's really difficult in any of those conversations. What I'll do is I'll turn the volume up and I'll put us into a restaurant.
So guess who I ran into from high school the other day? Who? Janice Thompson. No. Yeah.
Excuse me, ladies.
Hi.
How's everything going?
Good, thank you.
Your tuna milk good?
Oh, so good.
Oh, here, I'll take this one out of the way.
Thank you.
Refill on the iced tea?
Yeah,
Okay,
sure. Just
great.
one.
I'll be
Thanks.
right back.
Lemon, thank you.
You hear lots of noise around you.
So guess who I ran into from high school the other day? Who? Janice Thompson. No. Yeah.
Excuse me, ladies.
Hi.
How's everything going?
So again, we
Good,
see
thank you.
a
Your tuna milk
reduction
good?
in
Oh,
the
so good.
Oh, here, I'll take this
amplification
one out
of
of the way.
sound.
Refill
Also,
on
we're
the iced tea?
starting to lose those speech sounds.
Yeah,
Okay,
sure. Just
great.
one. Thanks.
I'll be right back.
Lemon, thank you. So guess who I ran into from high school the other day? Who? Janice Thompson.
And even if we're reading this, what we can see is actually if we're reading it, we're still missing some of that conversation because it's kind of hard to make it out. And it's really hard to make that out in terms of your hearing as well. So I've left that link on the slide deck for you. So you can go back to it and you can have a little look yourself. Oh, it's there. But it is a really interesting thing. I've got multiple amplifications here, it's interesting. So you can see where the issues start to be in that social environment. So we talked before about what happens in terms of vision, where you might not want to go out if you're going out at night. You might not want to go out if you've got issues with it's changed, hasn't it? It's very, very loud. In terms of the peripheral vision, etc., you're going to have the same issues with sound. So as a quick show of hands, how many people here have ever tried a hearing aid? Nobody? If you ever get the option to, I'm not saying if you start to have hearing loss, but if you go to one of these demonstrations or what have you, and you get the option to try one, try it. It is the most disconcerting thing you will ever try, because it doesn't amplify. Obviously, it's slightly different if you're on a hearing loop, but generally as a hearing aid, it doesn't just amplify voices, it amplifies everything. So you can hear someone speaking at the same volume as you can hear them with something rubbing up against their clothing. So you might hear this at the same volume. So what you've got is a lot of contrasting sounds and everything just being amplified up. So again, I didn't really understand what this was like until my grandmother started wearing a hearing aid. And she told me to go along when she had her fitting and try one out. And they were the most disconcerting things because you have to get your brain used to them. So her idea was initially, well, I don't like it, so I'm not going to wear it. What that meant was she never really got used to it to start with, so her brain couldn't really cancel out, because it's a kind of a combination of your brain being able to cancel out some of the noise and the amplification of a hearing aid. So when you start to get used to it, they become very effective. But before you get used to it, it's just very confusing. Okay? So if you do get the option, do try a hearing aid. Okay, so prebiscusis. I've learnt the word because I struggled with it a lot over the last couple of years. We have conductive prebiscusis. So we're talking about this in terms of the types of hearing loss that we can get. So these are basically the types of damage that you get from conductive, i.e. things touching. Okay, so these are ear infections, people using Q-tips to clean their ears, again, having exposure to loud noise. So this is very much about the inner ear bones going bang, 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 backwards and forwards. And that's where you start to see an increased risk of arthritis and damage to these bones, okay? So what we see is as we age, if we have conductive prebiscusis, that's damage of conduction. So where there's actually a physical touching of these between them, okay? And these are generally here around the ossicles, okay? So with the anvil, hammer, and stirrup bones. The other type you have is sensorineural prebiscusis. One of the papers that you've got for your readings today is also given as a link down here, so if you happen to want to click on it that way, you can do, but obviously it's also in your reading folder. This is slightly different, so it's not necessarily to do with that conductive nature, but it's to do with those hair cells. So the hair cells that are on the inside of the inside the cochlea, on the basal membrane on the inside of the cochlea. Okay? So basically what happens here is the hair cells are destroyed. So this isn't to do with the conductive nature, so whereby the banging becomes less efficient. It's to do with how those neural signals are transmitted. So it's all to do with those little hairs. If the little hairs die, so again, think of it like this. If you've got 100 people all going, yay, you can hear that. If a few of them die, even yay, it's even less. And if you only got one or two, yay, you can't hear them. So think of that in terms of the hairs. If you've got all of them working, then fine, you can hear everything. But the more and more die, the less and less transmission you've got in terms of the neural signals. And that is a very simplistic way of looking at the difference between conductive and sensorineural. You have the inner ear conductive prebiscusis, which is an atrophy then of the cochlear membrane, which is different. So you've got the two sorts here. You've got the sensory and the inner ear conductive. So one is banging, 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 causing the degradation of the cochlear membrane, and then the other is to do with the death of the hairs inside the cochlea as well. So they're the two main kinds that you'll find. And then we're looking at the neural and strial, which is a type of sensorineural, which again is about net death of those neural pathways due to the degradation of the pathways because of nerve death. Okay, so here what we're looking at is going this way in terms of the nerve transmission. Okay, so basically the ones that you've got to think about here is conductive is physical loss, and neurosensoral is because of the loss of hairs and therefore the loss of those neural signals. Okay, so that's again in a very nutshell what you've got to be looking for. So how many people have ever suffered with tinnitus? Anybody know what tinnitus is? You might say it's the ringing. Oh, sorry, carry on. Sorry, I didn't see your hand go up.
Oh,
There we go.
Yeah, I was gonna say just the ringing of like in your ears, having like a stimulus.
Yeah. So tinnitus, one of the most common sounds is a ringing in the ear, but it can be like. Have any of you ever put those conch shells up to your ear and you can hear the ocean? That's basically your own blood that's going around in your ear. But you can often have that noise going around, so like a whooshing noise. You can sometimes have a clicking noise, but it's something you can't necessarily get rid of. So, again, abstracting just for a moment, take away from the actual issue that you've got. Okay? Actually, no, we'll talk about it first. We'll come back to it, promise you. So what you've got is that constant ringing, that constant banging, that constant clicking in the ear, and it's associated with many different hearing disorders, including and mainly hearing loss or hearing damage because of loud sounds. Okay? It is not really understood that well, to be honest with you. Often what we find is that it can't be cured because there's no real physical cause for it. So it could be due to damage, it could be due to antibiotics, it could be due to a whole range of different things. But it's not really caused by one specific thing. So trying to cure it is kind of difficult. And what we find is that it's often to do with blood pressure. So I talked to you before about the conch shell, where you put it against your ear, and actually it's not the sea that you're hearing, but it's actually your own blood. It's a similar sort of principle. So what you find is here you've got the interaction between the social and the biological, in the sense that you have tinnitus. You get told by your doctor that it might not ever go away. That's going to make you a little bit anxious. That level of anxiety is going to raise your blood pressure. Raising of the blood pressure is going to cause more issues with regard to tinnitus. So you find it becomes a cyclical motion, okay? So you get the high blood pressure, which leads to more tinnitus, which leads to more anxiety, which leads to more blood pressure, which leads to more tinnitus, and round and round and round that circle goes. And what we find is actually a little bit of relaxation, not in terms of 420 or gummies, but in terms of just relaxation, so trying to wind down, to try and relax and not worry about these things, is actually one of the most effective ways of reducing the effects and impacts of something like tinnitus, okay? So remove the loud noise stimuli and relax, okay? So if you don't already, put on a few candles, have some Enya or something playing in the background, and enjoy. So this is what I want you to think about as well, is we're going to be discussing this much more next week, not in terms of tinnitus, but in terms of global contexts with aging. How might tinnitus, for example, or hearing loss be impactful differently in different countries?
In different countries, people may have different ways of life and cultural practices that may depend on the type of things that they hear and listen to. Like possibly being in a church where they may ring the bells very loudly, or the type of events they go to has very loud music of different decibels. Yeah.
Yep. So for example, you might be going to lots of street festivals because that's important within your culture. You might be going to church, and church can be incredibly loud. I remember when I was a wee whippersnapper back in the UK, I went up a church spire just as they started ringing. That lasted with me for a long time of trauma. Anything else? Okay, I'll give you a reflection, the difference actually between the UK and the US. So I noticed this because there's a lot of construction that's going on in the US at the moment, yeah? Especially around Los Angeles, because obviously everybody wants to live in a micro apartment, so they're building more micro apartments. Or maybe that's just everyone can afford one. Where was we going with this one? Noise, construction, fabulous. In the UK, what you find is there's a lot of unions, a lot of workers' protection rights, And on a construction site, my sister works in construction, and they make sure that everyone has got all of the hard hats, they've got all of the ear protections, everything else. If there's any sort of noise on site, everyone's got earplugs, and they've got their headphones and everything else. Over here, she came over and she was staying with me over in Silver Lake, and there's a big construction of a large building going up not too far from where I am, and they were all just jumping from scaffold to scaffold, and it was all shaking. It wasn't really put up that greatly, but there was also a lot of noise, and none of them had hearing protectors on. Similarly, when you look around and there's people doing road works, often they'll be there with those big jackhammer drills going, and they won't have ear protection on. It might be that it's supposed to be there, but it's not necessarily as strictly adhered to. It might be that they have to buy their own hearing protectors, etc. But then when we're looking at this around the world, what we see is different countries which are lesser economically developed, that might be going through their own industrial revolution. An example of this, I was over in India a couple of years ago, been over there quite a bit, and they have an awful lot of construction work, an awful lot of road works, and an awful lot of noise. There are almost zero when it comes to the levels of hearing protection that these people have. So what we find is that different countries around the different countries in the world will have different levels of risk based on their levels of legislation, based on the safety protocols, and also based on the stage that they're at. So you'll find that countries that need more infrastructure are going to have more issues with construction, and places where they should have more infrastructure, like here, are going to have less construction noise. Okay? So what we've got to try and think about is how this affects different people around the world. So next week, we are going to look much more specifically at aging around the world, but this week, obviously, we've got to think about how all of these can be contextually applied. So what are the indications then of hearing impairment? Well, we talked about that before in terms of slightly losing a bit of sounds. The first ones that we lose are things like the consonants, the S sounds, the soft sounds, the PHs, the Fs, the Zs, the sounds that can often be misinterpreted as another sound. Okay? These are the ones that generally go first. And we find that we lose these in conversation. So when we're speaking with an older person, these are the sounds that we need to be aware of. And when we're actually with a loved one, with relatives who are older, and we start to worry about sounds or we worry about hearing loss, these are the kind of things that we can look for. Look for the inability to hear a clock ticking, the inability to hear these consonant sounds or the soft vowel sounds. And also things like having the TV up at number 40 instead of 20 on the sound volume. So these things we can start to identify as where hearing loss might start to come. But also we've got to think of this as cumulative effect, that if we start to see damage and that's causing us to have to turn the volume up of the TV, the increased volume of the TV itself is then causing more damage. So actually we find that these can be counterproductive. In terms of engaging in social environments, you heard from that Starkey test that actually if you're in a social environment and you can't really hear anything, you can't engage in conversation, why would you want to go out? That's when we start to see these issues around social isolation and loneliness. And also you see, as we talked about before, right at the start of this section, in terms of stigma around dementia. One of the things, again, that my grandmother, using my family as an example, my mum will love this when she comes to visit in a couple of weeks, but is my grandmother would take a hearing aid out because she didn't like the noise in big social environments. So she would just sit there. She wouldn't engage with anybody. So they'd think that she was stupid or that she'd got dementia because she wasn't answering conversation, she wasn't engaging in conversation, and she was just sitting there with a smile on her face because that's what you do. She would sit there, and when she got a hearing aid in at home, she'd sit down and talk to me and she'd say, right, what was going on? And I'd have to fill her in on everything that had happened because she didn't want to listen to all that cacophony of noise on the outside as well. So what can we do then to support these people with hearing impairments? Well, this is where all of us come in. There are little things you can do. Speak face to face. So again, this is partly to do with vision, and partly to do with hearing. So we talked about being able to identify where sounds come from, which direction they come from. And that can be benefited if you're looking at somebody directly, they can see how your mouth is moving. So if they might miss the odd word or the odd consonant sound, then they might be able to get what you're saying from lip reading. Again, combining vision and hearing. Stand where there's good lighting, so people are actually able to see where you are. And unlike me, don't walk around all of the time. Actually have that conversation face to face. Turn off distractor noises, so things like radios and TVs. And try to speak slightly louder than normal, but don't shout and don't use baby talk. So just because you've got to say things louder doesn't mean to say you should start to lose your richness of vocabulary. You shouldn't start to infantile people. Try to stay patient and positive and relaxed, because the more you get agitated, the more they will also become agitated. And also try to give them clues on topics, because what we all tend to do is use our own contextual information. So if I start talking to you about university, and then you hear the words polar bear, you're going to start to see some incongruence there. But if we start talking about university and then I ask you what your opinion is of the classroom, even if you've not heard the conversation, you're going to infer some knowledge based on your understanding of that context. So we do that quite a lot. So we'll find that older adults with hearing impairments will often use contextual clues to fill in the blanks that they have not heard. Okay? Also, similarly, you might be using words that people don't understand. Believe it or not, language develops, lexicon develops. I'm going to start to use words that you probably might not have understood or might not have heard because you're all the youth. But back in my day, we might have had different expressions for things. So, I don't know, what do the kids these days say is for cool, if something's cool? They say it's... There we go. For me, that is what you have in a room with a lamp on. But you'd say something was cool. So vernacular changes, the way we express things. So it might just be that actually they have no understanding what lit means, other than having a nice Tiffany lamp that's on in the room. So it's about understanding that these certain changes might not even be to do with hearing, but might just be to do with cultural change as well. So, talk to you about hearing aids. So I've talked to you about what they actually do. They are really important. What they do is there's a whole range of hearing aids. So in the UK, what happens is you get fitted for a hearing aid and they put the best hearing aid that works for you. Over here, they say, well, we're going to fit you for a hearing aid. We'll give you the best hearing aid that you can afford. So what we find is often differences in terms of the quality of life that are experienced based on what people can afford and what people are able to use. So they do range. So they have analog and digital. They still have analog hearing aids. And these can range anything from a couple of $100 all the way through to multiple thousands of dollars, depending on what kind of hearing aid they are. So again, I look around here and I see that you've all put a lot of effort into what you look like. So you've all probably spent hours this morning thinking, I know what Paul's going to like if I wear this. He's going to like the fact I've worn this jumper. Sweatshirt, sorry, jumper over here means something very different. How many of you here have decided that you're going to wear some lovely brown plastic jewellery? How many of you would wear brown plastic jewellery on a night out? You're going out to, I don't know, I'm trying to think of a club. Name me a club. Somewhere, where do the kids go? I'm thinking of an 80s night at Los Globos. But you've got like the big brown chunky plastic earrings. You wouldn't wear it, would you? You might wear something that's psychedelic yellow or something that's psychedelic pink, but you wouldn't wear brown plastic, would you? No. So when we look at this in terms of social stigma, if you've got a behind-the-ear hearing aid, which is basically a lump of brown, no one's skin color is ever that. It doesn't matter where you are in the world, your skin color is never the same skin color as a hearing aid. Okay? It's obtuse, it's horrible, and it's really big and clunky. And what you'll find is that some people don't want to wear them purely because they look bad, and they've got the stigma associated with that. So if you see somebody with a hearing aid, you think, oh, they're deaf. You don't think they're hard of hearing, you think, oh, they're deaf. and you'll treat them differently. So you might start to speak slowly and more loudly and use simple words because, again, we have these misconceptions about not being able to cognitively understand when that's not the case. And people don't necessarily like that. So you have the in-the-ear hearing aids, which are like the ones on the top, which are a lot less obtrusive. Obviously, you can still see them to an extent, but they are much less obtrusive. They're also more effective in terms of what sorts of pitches that they can pick up from. Also, it takes time to adjust to them. So I mentioned before about if you get the opportunity to try one, because actually they're really disconcerting. Okay? And only when you've tried one can you understand just how disconcerting it is. So I could do the whole lecture talking like this and banging this and talking with another microphone on as well, so you've got audio issues, and we could get Kelly to start talking into a microphone at the same time as well, seeing who you can listen to. And that is basically what a basic hearing aid does. Okay? So it's really difficult to get used to it. It takes time to adjust. So what are the impacts? So we've talked about what it actually means in terms of the hearing loss and what sorts of sounds you lose the sound for. But we find that if we start to have hearing issues, then actually that causes issues for our speech as well. Because what we find is that if we're not speaking, or if we're not listening to language as much, we're not using language as much because we're not communicating as much. So we see deteriorations in that. So what we find is that older adults will process and produce speech at a slower speed. So again, you might think you can't wait for me to become an older person because I'm actually going to speak at a volume and at a speed that will actually be coherent. But as we age, we find that those levels of what's what I'm looking for? The levels of speech sound and the speed at which we speak decreases. Younger people can perceive both. Older people can perceive both, but it takes longer in terms of processing time. Okay? And one of the reasons why older adults can still process that is because of those contextual cues. So we talked about that before. So if you can't necessarily hear things, what we do is we look at top-down processing. So here what we're doing is we're looking at an environment that we're engaging with. It might be an environment that we're very familiar with. So what we do is we take contextual cues. So we know who's around. We know if we're with a group of friends, they're probably all going to be talking about that one friend that's never there. We know that if you're with a group of work colleagues, they're always going to be talking about that one person that's always hiding away in their lab or doing some work with somebody else, etc. We've got the environmental cues, so you don't necessarily have to always hear. So what we find is that older adults will often engage with top-down processing, using prior knowledge to inform current situations. Whereas the youth, the kids, will use what we call bottom-up processing. They'll take that sensory information. So through any of the 5 senses that we've briefly talked about, they will take that sensory information, they'll process that, and they will react to that sensory stimuli. So that is when you're able to do so. So what we're saying is that when you start to have impairments as you age, you tend to compensate. And we'll talk about compensation modeling later on in the course. But what we're seeing is they take more contextual cues as we age. Okay? Any questions so far? No? Fabulous. Okay, so I talked briefly about the vestibular system. I'll get it for you, it's all right, check it. So we talked about the vestibular system. So the vestibular system is your gyroscope, how you keep your balance. So it's just another function of the ear. So it shows that the ear isn't just about sound. The ear is about balance too. So we know that older adults are more at risk than younger adults of falling. And the greatest predictor of falls in the future is having had a fall in the past. So what we find is older adults become exponentially more at risk the more that they have issues with their ear, the more they have issues with falls, and they're more likely to continue to have those problems, which as we talked about earlier on as well, can lead to traumatic brain injury if they bang their heads, which again, all of these are factors that can add up to issues with hearing and with vision. So the vestibular system essentially is your internal gyroscope, and that is basically water again, or the liquid inside the cochlea, and it works in the semicircular canal. So essentially you have a canal going that way, you have a canal going that way, and you have a canal going that way. Okay, so once again, you've got it going that way, and that way. So every direction that you are, the water or the liquid moves around in those canals to give you orientation. So obviously, if you're lying on your side, there's going to be more on that side than there is on this side. And if you're standing up, there's going to be more across the bottom than there is going to be at the top. So it's a way of your body basically regulating where you are in time and place. And the way it does this is the same as it takes on sound, is by the hairs, exactly. So if you've got issues with dead hairs in your ears, not on the outside of the ears, that's just gross, but on the inside of your ears, then what you'll find is that not only you have issues with sensory neural hearing, but also issues with your vestibular system and being able to maintain uprightness. Okay, so you've got, again, increased risk of falls. Okay? And what we find is in terms of balance, in terms of gait, and similarly in terms of social interaction. So you're less likely to want to get up and walk about if you feel unsteady on your feet. And think about this if we take it to the nth degree. If you're unsteady on your feet and you're not going out and walking, well, if you're not walking, then maybe actually you'll start to lose that muscle definition and strength. So then you maybe lose the ability to do that walking. And that maybe then will fall onto even less options for engagement socially and civically. So what we see is something as simple as something like a hearing aid, or as minimizing the damage that we can do environmentally to our hearing, can have massive knock-on effects. And that's really what I'm going to try and get you to do throughout the whole duration of this course, is to understand that no one week that we're looking at is in isolation. Every single week, we're building on what we've done before, and actually when we look at the implications, they are cumulative, okay? So next week when we're looking at looking at driving, we're going to be including things from vision and also from hearing. Taste. Some people have it, some people don't. How many people here like In-N-Out burgers? Sorry? You don't? I love them. I'm all about that animal styling. They're good. But just don't do a 4x4 animal-style burger with animal-style fries. That's too much animal for anyone. Okay? Trust me, I tried it. I felt it for about a week. 4x4 is their biggest, by the way. Anyway, that's by the by. I love secret menus. The reason why I mention this is, one, because high levels of salt in that, so actually you'll be able to taste that later on. But also on the 1st of October is International Day of Older Persons, and that is on a Tuesday. How many people have got lectures all day on Tuesday? All day? All day. Oh. We are giving away free In-N-Out burgers if you come to the events. So if you come to the quad, you can get a little token from me. I'll be there. I'll be the ringmaster. We can give you little tokens and you get free In-N-Out burgers. Or if you're one of those people that doesn't eat meat, you can have an amaze bowl as well. We've got them there because we have to cater for those people like plant-based foodage. Where was he going with this? Taste. There we go. So we're looking at taste. We're looking at different senses. We're looking at burgers. We're looking at amaze bowls. What we're seeing is as we age, similarly, taste declines. Not because of the type of clothes that you wear, but because of the issues with the tongue. Taste buds, thank you so very much. As nearly, hey, 6 hours, back to back. We're doing well, we're doing well, we're nearly there. What we see is we've got these different tastes that we have, of sweet, of sour, of fatty, of umami, all these different aspects of taste. And we find that they actually all start to decline as we age, especially in terms of saltiness and sweetness. So what does this really mean? Actually, no, we'll come back to that. If I haven't told you, Paul, what does this really mean? And we'll discuss that. So in terms of the primary taste cortex, what we know is that actually those responding to taste are not that massively affected, but they tend to be more around those more gestalt flavors, okay? So here what we've got is the wider appreciation of taste. So if you remember, we talked before about oatmeal, yeah? About the sloppy taste of unsavored, seasoned. Whoa, we've got these words, they're struggling. I'm struggling at the moment. And we'll also do tip of the tongue syndrome later on in the course. We're looking at taste being something that actually declines, but it declines because it isn't just a standard process. Taste is multisensory. So if you were to taste and put a blindfold on, it wouldn't taste as rich. If you were to put nose plugs on or a nose whatever clip, again, similarly, you wouldn't taste the food as richly because taste is very much multisensorial. So if we see declines in these, we're seeing declines in all of these areas. And why does that cause a problem? Well, as we said before, the problem you've got is not very many people like oatmeal in terms of plain oatmeal with no seasoning, with nothing in there. And if all of your food tastes like bland oatmeal, you're unlikely to want to eat it. So what are you going to do? You're going to whack a little bit more salt on your food. Okay, you can taste the food now. Yeah, hey, fabulous. But salt increases your blood pressure. Increasing blood pressure, as we've said, is bad for your vision. It's bad for your cardiovascular system, and generally it is just bad. Also, we're going to have a bit of a dessert now. So you've got some strawberries, or you've got a nice bit of cobbler or crumble. You can't really taste it, so what are you going to put over the top of it to bring out that flavor? You're going to put a bit of sugar over it. You're not going to put salt on it. You're going to put a little bit of sugar over that. Okay, what's the issue there? If we're putting more and more salt and more sugar on our food, well, actually what we're doing is, one, we're potentially causing issues with our teeth, with our gums, and oral hygiene is a massive issue in this aspect because with increased cavities, etc., you're also increasing your risk of oral cancers. In terms of just putting lots of sugar on things, you're increasing your risk of becoming a bit like a donut, like eating too much. You become a little bit more overweight. That's not necessarily good for you. In terms of your cholesterol levels. So what we're seeing is that in order to eat, we're enhancing the flavor profiles, but by enhancing the flavor profiles, if we're doing so just by increasing salt and sugar, which are the basic ways of doing so, actually we're going to end up with even worse comorbid issues as well. So we've got to look at this in terms of a wider profile. Obviously, there are certain things you have to think about. Like I said to you, maybe week one, when I was talking about my grandmother liking slices of butter with her bread. In her 90s, you know what? If she likes a bit of extra salt on food, it's not going to cause her to live far less than she would have done normally, and she enjoys it. But we've got to be very conscious of those knock-on health effects. So when we're looking at how tastes change with age, what we find is that there are decrements for things like caffeine, citric acid, so sour issues, and also things like quinine. So how many people here have ever had a gin and tonic? That bitter taste that you get in the tonic, that's from quinine. Okay? So that's that flavor profile that we're talking about. And what we also find is, so how many of you like cabbage or Brussels sprouts? Okay? Most people will start to like those as they get older, will not like them as kids because they've got high levels of bitter taste to them. They're actually a little bit toxic. But as we age, even as we're younger aging, so like in our 30s, 20s, 30s, we actually lose sensitivity for that bitterness taste that we have as kids. So very, very few kids will actually like those really rustic green leafy vegetables because they have a very bitter taste to them. And we see a smaller change in sweet foods, which again, using my grandmother as an example, which is why she will maybe skip a starter or what do you call them over here? An appetizer. Might skip her appetizers, but she'll definitely go for a large, nice dessert because she likes the flavor profile of that, because there are less declines in that level of taste. So, as we said before, the causes of these change can be because the decreased number and sensitivity of the taste buds that are there. Also in terms of the amount of saliva that we have. You might think, well, why does that matter? Well, when we're breaking down food, it's not just, and I'm going to say this very carefully, it's not just mastication, it's also the amount of saliva that you have that breaks down the food particles that enables you to taste these things. Also in terms of the nervous pathways. So again, what else declines as we age? White matter, fabulous. So we're looking at those neural connections. So again, we're looking at the transfer and the understanding of what these tastes are as we're processing them. What we also find is that if we've had gum disease or false teeth or cavities and things like that, that can cause decreases in the sensitivity of your taste buds. So the more cavities you've had, the replacements, etc., can actually damage the nerve endings on your tongue. Also, we've got tastes of drugs. So drugs can cause issues the same as they can with your hearing, with the way in which you taste. But similarly, if you've ever been on chemotherapy or anything like that, that can actually change, can kill your taste buds and make everything taste metallic. And as such, again, you're unlikely to want to eat if essentially it's like chewing on the end of a pencil. So it's about actually finding ways in which we can overcome this. But also we have to think about it in terms of our masticatory abilities. So older adults might not necessarily be able to chew as much because of muscle strength in their jaws. So what we can actually do is there are some fabulous, when I was in the UK, they had actually designed a whole set of food molds. So this was where you'd get something like a pork chop, and it would be mushed down and reformed, so it's like a really soft, like a foamy pork chop. But it was made to look like a pork chop, and it really actually genuinely looked like a pork chop and tasted like a pork chop, but it just had no resistance to it. Which is great compared to what we usually do, is just whack everything in the blender, use an ice cream scoop and plop it on there. So that will never look like a roast dinner. It won't even taste like it. Because again, eating is a multi-sensory process. So if we can make food look, smell, and taste like we remember it, then we'll find that nutrition is so much more easy to engage with older adults, especially when we're looking at trying to enhance flavors because of changes that occur because of medications or the aging process. So some of these problems, we've gone over these sometimes. What they show is a decreased, so a loss of appetite, which can mean that you're actually adding more salt, etc., etc. You might also mistake things. So you might mistake your salt for your sugar based on a flavor profile. And we've already talked about this, so I won't go over this too much in terms of adding increased flavorings. So what about the others? So we've talked quite heavily about vision. We've talked quite heavily about hearing. And you're probably thinking, dear God, Paul, please be quiet. But we've still got a few more to go for. So the olfactory senses. So as I mentioned right at the start, these are the ones that don't necessarily decline too much with age. So as a standardized process, yes, we lose a little bit, but the main reason that we see a loss is, anybody remember? What can cause the loss of smell as we age? Anybody? the disease state of Alzheimer's. If you remember, I said that at the start. We said that actually smell is the one sense that doesn't really decline to any massive level as we age, but it does do in the presence of Alzheimer's. And also it can decline in terms of medications, but as a standard aging process, it doesn't decline too much. How it can decline is if we have allergies and it causes scarring on the inside of the nasal capacity. Also, if you have brain injuries, if you have cancer treatment, and other issues like other medications. So if you have lots of medications together. Polypharmacy, there we go. Well, I got co in my mind and we were going to go with it. But what we also find is that although you might not necessarily lose the think of it in terms of object recognition. So we talked about object recognition, yeah? When we're looking at eyesight. Yes? No? Yes? So we said, actually, as your eyesight deteriorates, you might take longer to identify an object. And as we age, even if you've not got massive deterioration, if you've got standard age-related deterioration, it will take you longer as an older person to identify particular objects. The same happens with smell. It might take you longer to identify what a particular smell is. So you go, oh, that smells nice, but I don't know what it is. Or that smells really hideous, I don't know what it is. And what we find is that, again, it's more about those neural pathways, about that identification, rather than actually being able to smell what that particular smell is. So the different ones that we talked about before in terms of touch receptors, these are important as we discussed in terms of selecting materials to make objects from. So if you remember, we talked about the glass in a hospital, what that glass should be made out of, whether it should be soft plastic, hard plastic, or glass, and we opted for hard plastic. Fabulous. But we also have to think about things like pain, in terms of heat, in terms of cold. So if we're losing skin receptors, if we're losing these pain receptors and these touch receptors on our skin, then actually this could cause certain issues in terms of pain thresholds. So obviously some women in here would say that childbirth is really painful. I would argue that stubbing your toe is more painful. But as we age, we actually lose some of these pain receptors. So it could be so for example, I generally do, I shouldn't do this because occasionally it does blister, but I have very high pain threshold. Pick stuff up off an oven and just move it onto the side and things like this. And I realize when I've got blisters and things that potentially shouldn't have done that, but I've got quite a high pain threshold. And we find that as we age, that pain threshold goes up because the receptors go down, okay? So our threshold goes up because the number of receptors go down. But using my stupidity as an example, what that means is actually we are more susceptible to injury, especially from extreme heat. So when we don't realize something is hot. So how many people here have done the old thing of seeing whether an iron is hot by touching the metal part of the iron? We've probably all done it. We've probably gone, oh, I wonder if that's hot. I've just turned it off. Yes, it is. But we might not realize that. And if we don't realize that, then actually we might spend more time in contact with it. So you pick up a saucepan, a metal saucepan, and that handle is the word I was looking for, and that handle is particularly hot. So we find that can actually lead to more issues with burns and things like that. We do find, as we are going to discuss later on in the course, when we're looking specifically at pain, pain is also subjective. So again, building on subjectivity versus objectivity. So your idea of what might be painful and mine might be very, very different, but they differ based on age, they differ based on gender, they differ based on cultural expectation as well. So there is some evidence to suggest that pain itself, the receptors to pain decrease as we age, but it's more about the identification of what that pain source is that deteriorates as we age. So we will discuss this one later on in the course. So when we're looking at, again, pulling from last week from that objectivity versus subjectivity, when we're looking at pain measurement, if I were to go and kick Kelly in the shin and say, on a scale of 1 to 10, how much does that hurt? She might go, you're a big wussy, that only hurts on a scale of like 4. I might go and kick one of you in the shins and you go, ow, that's a 9. because that is a subjective measure. The ways in which we can make this slightly more objective is by adding things like color, adding words, and adding smiley faces. So we can start to create some anchoring points. So for example, you might say, well, actually, I said it was a 9, but it didn't make me feel like this. It made me feel a little bit more perturbed. So maybe it is slightly a 4 rather than a 9. So what we find is we get a much more accurate representation of pain in terms of, irrespective of age, if we just provide anchor points. So again, that gives objectivity to a subjective measure. Okay? Make sense? Fabulous. Okay, I can see there's lots of flagging eyes, so I promise we are just going to do a review and then you are free to go. So, first of all, before we review, are there questions on what we've gone over so far? I can just see that people want to get out. Okay, we are going to do a, how many people have seen, oh, it's not the same here, is it? Price is Right. We had a top, middle, and bottom. Supermarket sweep. So ignore me. It's a British analogy. I'm going to have somebody from the back, somebody from the middle, somebody from the front is going to give me an overview of what we have learnt today. So, who wants to go first? What have we learnt? The easiest person is to go first because they can mention anything. There we go. We've got a lovely lady from the back.
We learn about brain change and like scenery decline, like vision, hearing, taste, and smell, touch, and pen.
Okay.
And normal vision change and change in eyes. Yeah.
Excellent. So what we looked at initially was brain changes. So we looked at the age at which we see white matter change and the age at which we see grey matter change. We've linked that then to sensory decline that happens across the life course. Okay? Anything specific else that we've learned today? We've got 2 more regions before we go. Dun, 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 dun. Oh, sorry. I should have done that one. There we go. I'm coming. It's just me being lazy.
Intervention for vision loss, and more about how to protect our vision.
Yeah, so we looked at vision loss. So what we've done is we've looked at the physical impacts of vision loss. So what that means in terms of the structure of the eye. So what happens to the lens? What happens to the cornea? What happens to the fovea? What happens to the macula? We know all of these things, but we also look at the social aspect. So it's not just the biological, the physiological change, but we're looking at those social impacts as well. And that's the real key. That's where the psychology of this is all coming in. This isn't just a biology course, I promise you. What we're doing is we're looking at the social implications of those biological changes. Okay? Anything else? One more thing, and then I'll enable you to fly away, my pretties. Dun, 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 dun. Anybody? It's fine, I can stand here for 15 minutes.
That those of us who use Q-tips are damaging the little hairs in our cochlea, and that can ultimately end up affecting your balance too, not just your hearing.
Yeah. So when we're looking specifically at Q-tips, for example, what that does is I could put you on the spot, but I won't be. If you remember, they said there's 2 types of hearing loss. We said there's conductive and sensorineural. When we're looking at Q-tip loss, that's conductive, because essentially you're not actually clearing out the ear wax, you're whacking it further in, and you're causing damage, okay? So that would cause conductive hearing loss, okay? Right, so I will put a discussion post up for you. You have got your summary articles, which are due very soon. So if you've got any queries or questions, ask us about this. I should have started with this, but I didn't. I forgot. So Kelly has got a couple of words to say to you about your discussion board posts, which you do need to listen to because there have been some concerning developments. But next week, we are going to be looking at aging in a global context, and we're going to be looking specifically at driving. And just to give you a little bit of a break, I've got a couple of little video clipettes for you as well. After you. The floor is yours.
Okay. So yeah, there was a lot of lively discussion on the board this week. Just quickly, just so I can get it out of the way, I do want to address that there was a bit of plagiarism going on. So I would encourage everyone to review Paul's slide 24, I think it was, from week 1, remembering that repurposing someone else's words and using them as your own, you have to credit that person who had the original thought. You can't just reword it and post it as if it was your original thought. So the articles, I mean, Paul and I have both read the articles, so we know what the researchers think. We want to know what you think. When Paul asked, for your analysis and your positives and negatives, it wasn't to retell us what the researchers said were the positives and negatives. The idea, I think, is, get it the right spirit, is that we want to hear what you thought. And it's okay to agree with them and their assessment of themselves and their limitations or the positives that came out of their study. But it's also okay to disagree or to point out things that you thought were flawed about that. There were some people did have questions. I tried to reply to everyone's sort of rhetorical questions, but because it's such a short period of time and some people didn't post until 15 minutes before class, so I can only do so much to really respond to some of the lengthy questions. So the earlier you post, the better. And maybe if we have time next time, some of the questions that people had, sort of differentiating between, primary data and secondary data and what's the value of that. There were some people who were questioning, the researchers didn't directly ask these people, the researchers didn't conduct these interviews themselves, they repurposed somebody else's interviews, and so there were some questions about that. And then also just some questions about some of the scales that were used. People took some issue with, for example, the UCLA 4-point loneliness scale, or 3-point loneliness scale. And some other scales where they only ask people a few questions. Maybe they only ask them 5 things. And so people were a little bit suspicious of how can we really know? And so I was going to have Paul sort of address some of those things. I mean, it's 13 minutes left, but those were a few of the questions, although I've got more. So if people do, especially online people or anybody who's here right now, if you have any quick questions you want to ask about the analyzing of those papers, now's the time for sure.
There are a couple of ways in which we can do this as well. Obviously, you can ask us questions, but you can also use the hive brain. Okay, so you can post things on Blackboard in the free discussion section. You can also post things on the questions for professors questions. You can also just try and create these. And so I know that the assessment is that you have to make 1 post and 1 comment. Yeah? As Kelly mentioned, it's kind of difficult to do a comment on somebody's post if they only post it 15 minutes before the deadline. But although we say you need to make 1 post and 1 response, that is a minimum. If you want to actually engage in a conversation with people online and try and get more from this as a learning experience, post away, enjoy yourselves, actually have a conversation with each other online. I know it's something that no one does anymore. No one discusses things online. Everyone discusses things face to face. So I know you're all unfamiliar about typing on a keyboard because no one does that anymore. So it is something you might want to do. So you can actually end up answering each other's questions, but you also know that both Kelly and I are here as a resource. Okay. Are there any questions? Any burning concerns? If they're too burning, then go and see a doctor. But
No, you're good. I guess to my understanding, that when you asked what are the key findings, the methods, and the analysis. We thought you were asking like how did they analyze the study. So I think there was a misunderstanding on our part. Like, do you want us to analyze it, or do you want us to tell you how they analyzed it? And then that was just my first thing. And then my second thing was when we want to comment or post on one of our classmates' posts, can it be a sub post? Like, let's say my main post, then someone responds. Would it count if I responded to that person that responded? Or do I have to be the first person to respond to someone's main post?
You don't have to be the first person to respond.
So
You can have a thread of everybody in the class could all comment on one person's, and then everyone could comment on somebody else's, and that's fine. You can have multiple. You can have one thread that has multiple answers to it. That's
So as long
absolutely
as
fine.
you're commenting and adding to the discussion.
And in relation to your first query question, was if we're asking you to summarize things, or if we're asking you to say, well, what were the findings, etc. Yes, we're not asking you to analyze the data yourselves. That's not what we're asking. But what we're asking for is for your interpretation of, have they made the right conclusions? Have they drawn things that are actually accurate from this? What do you think the quality of that work is? Do you think of something else they could have done differently? So it's about your interpretation of the findings as well. Okay, so it's not just, at no point am I going to ask you to go and contact the authors and try and get a new data set from them and all that other stuff, but it's just because, as I mentioned right at the start, I've spent quite a long time searching for different articles for you, and I've put some that are amazing and some that I've purposely put up that are a little bit atrocious, because I want you to look at them as critical gerontologists to understand where that quality line lies.
Okay. Just really quickly on the plagiarism question on discussion boards, is there, and I'm sorry if it's been answered already, but is there a citation expectation with discussion board posts? Like, especially if we're, referring to these articles where like the top of the post, for lack of a better phrase, has links to the articles, should we still like do a little works cited or something?
If you are, so for example, if you're discussing a particular article, obviously we know it's only going to be about that particular article, so you don't have to cite that, but it's your interpretation of it. So if you are, say, for example, giving word for word verbatim from their article, which you shouldn't do anyway, then obviously you'd have to put that in quotation marks. We know where it's going to come from because it is only from that particular article. But if you're starting to obviously discuss other articles and you want to bring them in and say, well, actually, this agrees with somebody else's work, then obviously you'd start to cite that. But if you're just referring back to the one article we're asking you to discuss, then there's no real necessity because everyone's going to be bringing the same thing.
Yeah, so what I saw was sort of like somebody lifted the researcher's exact sentence, changed a couple things around, and then posted it as their own idea. And so if you take a look at slide 24, it'll say, it'll ask you questions like, did I think this up myself, or is this something I'm actually taking from somebody else? And it guides you to if the answer is, yeah, I kind of just said what they said in a slightly different way. You know what I mean? So.
Say if I only got 2 points on my discussion board, can I write multiple posts, like replies to other students to make up my points?
No. That's basically it. As we said, there are no extra credit assignments. Once you have, essentially there is 1 point for the original post, there's 1 point for whether you do 1 response or 100 responses, and there's 1 point for the quality. Okay, and once that mark has been given for that week, obviously the discussion board is closed, and that's it. Okay. The whole point is that it's supposed to be an iterative learning process. So there are only small amounts of grades each week that are available, but it's that iterative process. So if you get feedback that says, actually, maybe you should have included this and that, maybe next week you include more, and that's when you start to get that learning process. So in short, no, there are no extra credit assignments.
And I did try really hard to give everybody feedback as much as I could, but it's such a short amount of time that the window closes and I want to try to get people their grades. So if you don't understand why I gave you a certain grade, just email me and we can talk about it so I can help help make it better for you and for everybody. Because the more people contribute, their own original ideas, the more interesting the discussion is.
Okay, if nobody else has any questions, we are at 5 minutes to 4. Try and beat the traffic, and I will see you next week. Have a great weekend.